Chapter 300. At the entrance of the magic potion shop, Yarbemia, who was wearing a black maid's outfit, plunged her head into Elizabeth's broad chest, who was wearing a blue dress. Elizabeth raised her hands reflexively, and Yarbemia's entire face was buried in her chest. Time seemed to have stopped in that instant, and silence ensued. Sorry. Yarbemia slowly raised her head from Elizabeth's chest, and apologized with a hint of embarrassment on her face. Can you take your face away from me now? A hint of embarrassment and frustration flashed through Elizabeth's cold face. If she hadn't seen who was pouncing on her, anyone who dared to touch her in such a manner would definitely have been reduced to a pile of ice by now. However, at the sight of this petite half-dragon girl, who had her face buried in her chest and was looking up at her with an embarrassed expression, Elizabeth abruptly halted the spell that she was about to unleash. For some reason, she was struck by a feeling that she was rather adorable. Sorry, I'm really sorry. Only then did Yarbemia return to her senses. She hurriedly took 2 steps back, and bowed to Elizabeth at a 45-degree angle. Even the tips of her ears were flushed as she thought to herself, what should I do? How could I do something so impolite? My God. But, it really is so big, so soft, so comfortable. Elizabeth looked at the frantic Yarbemia, and the hint of displeasure in her heart dissipated. Furthermore, she had been thinking about something else, so she hadn't noticed Yarbemia. Elizabeth's thoughts just so happened to have something to do with her. She knew that it was almost impossible for her to find her half-sister on the first day that she had received the news, but looking for someone in Chaos City was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Now that she had found a half-dragon girl of the right age, she naturally wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. I'm fine, Elizabeth said in a cold voice as she appraised Yarbemia. Yarbemia was a little petite, and her limbs were thin and slender. The strange black and white dress that she was wearing accentuated her figure perfectly, but her chest was a little big. She had a pair of small golden dragon horns on her head, and a white hairband on her head. Her golden hair was tied into a side ponytail that hung down to the right. What caught Elizabeth's attention were Yarbemia's different-colored eyes. Her left eye was golden, and her right eye black. A hint of surprise appeared in Elizabeth's dark blue eyes. She wasn't sure that Yarbemia had a pair of golden dragon bloodline, but it was undoubtedly a little more than a little. She's so beautiful. Yarbemia was also surreptitiously sizing up Elizabeth. Her skin was as fair as snow, and she was about 20 years old. She was extremely beautiful, and her long dress looked as if it had been carved out of ice. She was like a goddess who had descended from the heavens. She was just standing there casually, but her cold and arrogant aura made people want to lower their heads. In contrast to Sally's cold and noble aura, this girl's aura was pure and unadulterated. Yarbemia had rushed out of the door and bumped right into Yarbemia. Although Yarbemia had said that she was fine, she was still a little nervous. She lowered her eyes, and didn't know what to say. What's wrong, MIA? Sally's voice suddenly sounded. She saw Yarbemia walking out of the magic potion shop with her hands hanging by her sides as if she had done something wrong. Only then did she notice Elizabeth, and a hint of surprise flashed across her eyes. Is she a giant dragon? Sally began to speculate. Even though Yarbemia was in her human form, her aura was still a little different from that of a giant dragon. Furthermore, her innate arrogance further confirmed her suspicions. She wondered how Yarbemia had provoked this giant dragon maiden. Yarbemia felt a little more confident after hearing Sally's voice, and a little sheepishly said, I accidentally bumped into her. I told you, I'm fine. Elizabeth's brows furrowed slightly as she took a glance at Sally. A hint of surprise also appeared in her eyes as she thought to herself, this elf isn't simple. Judging from the magic waves emanating from her body, she's most likely just as powerful as I am. I wonder what her relationship is with her. Oh, it's the beautiful white dragon sister. Amy's elated voice sounded as she walked out of the door with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She looked up at Elizabeth. Amy, do you know her? Yarbemia was a little surprised. I met her a few days ago at the city gate with Father. She's so beautiful, so I remember her. Amy nodded before waving at Elizabeth, and saying, hello, big sister white dragon. Meow. Ugly Duckling, who was still in Amy's arms, was looking at Elizabeth with a hint of hostility in its eyes. It extended its little paws in an attempt to show off its claws. Millimeter HM. Elizabeth took a glance at Amy and nodded in greeting. She had seen that man riding a strange carriage with this little girl in the afternoon, and she didn't think that they would meet again at night. Furthermore, it appeared that they all knew each other. "I'm really sorry. My name is Yarbemia, but I have to go to work now. Goodbye." Yarbemia looked at the customers walking in and out of the restaurant, and hurriedly apologized to Elizabeth before hurrying into the restaurant. "Amy, let's go in as well." Sally took a glance at Elizabeth before walking into the restaurant with Amy's little hand in hers. Giant dragons were generally prone to anger, and they always acted according to their wishes, so she didn't want to leave Amy here alone. "Big Sister White Dragon, my restaurant's food is super delicious. You have to come and try it." Amy allowed Sally to lead her away obediently, but she still didn't forget to turn to Elizabeth. "Amy's." Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the restaurant's signboard for a while before making her way into the restaurant. Meg made his way over to Novan with a smile, and placed a tray in front of him as he said, "Here's your braised chicken and rice and savory tofu pudding. Please enjoy." "Sure." Novan nodded as his attention was drawn to the two delicacies in front of him. Golden chicken cubes, the alluring aroma of chicken soup, and all types of side dishes were cooked in a pot, but they didn't appear to be messy in the slightest. The rich reddish-golden chicken soup enveloped the chicken cubes, and Novan couldn't help but swallow. "Even though you've lived in Chaos City for several decades, when it comes to food, I still have to bring you here to eat the best." Crassus picked up a piece of braised chicken with his chopsticks, and put it into his mouth. He chewed slowly with a joyful expression on his face. "Shall I try it?" Novan also picked up his chopsticks and picked up a piece of chicken. The reddish-golden chicken soup enveloped the chicken cubes perfectly, and he put it into his mouth. The delicious chicken soup melted in his mouth first, and the flavor and aroma were enhanced to the extreme by some unknown spices. He gently bit into the chicken cubes, and the meat was tender and refreshing. After chewing carefully, he swallowed, and the flavor lingered in his mouth. Chapter 301. Elizabeth walked to the entrance of the restaurant, and suddenly stopped in her tracks. She turned her head slightly to look behind her, and saw a black shadow disappear into the bushes. She hesitated momentarily before turning around to leave. A blue frost appeared beneath her feet, and she disappeared from the street in the blink of an eye. "She's gone." After a while, a man wearing black tights came out of the bushes. He looked around anxiously, stamped his feet, and disappeared into the darkness again, walking through it. "Fox is spying on me." Elizabeth looked at the figure disappearing into the darkness from a nearby tree branch, and her brows furrowed slightly as a contemplative look appeared on her face. "Looks like father was right. Those people aren't trustworthy. I'll have to make a trip to that place today." Elizabeth gently stroked the ring on her right thumb as she turned to look in the direction of Amy's. She had already disappeared, leaving behind a trail of frost on the tree branch. Second young master, Director DeVoe of the DeVoe Tavern and Director Goodnear of the Goodnear Watch Company have been kept under wraps. We've spent a lot of money to bribe them, but only managed to get some rough information. In a slightly dim room, Mars looked at Cyril, who was sitting behind a desk opposite him, with a respectful expression, just like when he was standing beside President Jeffrey in the Aden Chamber of Commerce. Even the humble smile on his face was identical. "Tell me what's going on." The two of them are directors of our Aden Chamber of Commerce, and they're important figures in Chaos City. Isn't it a little disrespectful to the Aden Chamber of Commerce for them to be taken away for no apparent reason? Cyril crossed his legs as he gently tapped an intricate red pipe on the table, and looked at Mars with furrowed brows. "According to the information that we've received, they may have been involved in a 4th-tier incident, and a 3th-tier incident at the same time." Mars wore a grave expression as he looked at Cyril, and solemnly suggested, "Second young master, a 4th-tier incident is considered confidential in the Grey Temple, so it's best if we don't get too involved." "Level 4 incident." Cyril pursed his lips and leaned back on the leather chair behind him. He said indifferently, "So what if it's a level 4 incident?" Didn't you say that the people from the Devo Tavern and the Goody Watch shop have already sent the money over? Take half of it to the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle, and get them out of Bastille prison first. Otherwise, everyone will say that the Aden Chamber of Commerce is a pushover and can't even protect the directors. Then, spend money to settle the rest of the matter. If there's not enough money, let the two families think of other ways. Mars hesitated. All right, Miss Sina is still waiting for me tonight. Just convert the money into a deposit receipt from Buffett Bank and give it to me. Cyril put the pipe in his chest pocket, got up, and walked out while whistling. A fourth-level incident can't be solved with money. This pool is much deeper than we thought, second young master. Mars muttered to himself helplessly as he looked at the door. He stood in the dim room and fell into deep thought. Yarbemia and Sally returned to the restaurant and quickly got back to work. The restaurant resumed its efficient operation. Aside from the fact that the door had disappeared, and a patch of lush trees in a corner of the square had disappeared, everything seemed to be the same as before. All of the customers' emotions were gradually soothed by the delicious food, and they were immersed in the enjoyment of the food, quickly forgetting about their shock and displeasure. Father, Big Sister 1111 and Big Bear have already fallen asleep after Big Sister Aisha's treatment. Master Turtle Shell said that they'll be fine after a good night's sleep. Amy stood at the entrance of the kitchen with Ugly Duckling in her arms, and a smile appeared on her little face as she spoke to Meg. Yeah, you're all great. You've done a great job. Meg nodded with a smile as he looked at Amy and the others with approval in his eyes. Sally had saved the druid couple despite the risk of being exposed. Yarbemia was clearly not very powerful, but she still rushed to the forefront, and Amy had expressed her willingness to help them from the very beginning. The three of them were all very kind people, and that made him very happy. Meg wasn't opposed to helping others to the best of his ability. Elated smiles appeared on both Amy and Yarbemia's faces. Sally was also putting away the utensils with a smile on her face. She had never heard such praise before. I have to admit that this is the best food I've ever tasted. After finishing the second bowl of rice, Novan placed the last piece of shiitake mushroom in his mouth and chewed it carefully before putting down his chopsticks with a satisfied expression. Crassus also finished his braised chicken and rice at about the same time as Novan, and he asked, "Is it enough to change the world?" Novan nodded, and said, "If even a normal family can cook something as delicious as this, then it would definitely redefine the cooking style of the Norland continent." Crassus pursed his lips, and said, "If even a normal family can cook something as delicious as this, then it wouldn't even cost 800 copper coins per serving. So if you want to change the world, then this is probably not enough." Novan also smiled. That's not necessarily the case. Even if they can't cook something as delicious as this, I'm sure many people would still be willing to give it a try if they can make ordinary food more delicious. Crassus shook his head as he pointed at the bowl in front of him with a smile, and said, "This is a direction. Changing the world has never been something that a single person can do. Perhaps he can provide a direction that will convince everyone." Novan fell silent, and his eyes lit up as he looked at the bowl in front of him. He suddenly stood up and walked toward the door as he said, "I have something important to do. I'm very satisfied with tonight's dinner. Thank you for your hospitality. Hey, your savory tofu pudding is still." Crassus raised his hand to look at Novan, who had already disappeared out the door. He looked at the savory tofu pudding across from him, and shrugged nonchalantly as he scooped up a spoonful of sweet tofu pudding. He shook his head, and said, "Savory tofu pudding isn't that good anyway, so it's not a pity that I didn't eat it." All of the people sitting at the nearby tables immediately looked over at the untouched savory tofu pudding on the table. All of them wanted to say something, but refrained from doing so when they thought of Crassus' status. Chapter 302. Who told you that? Our little Amy only needs to cast a single fireball spell to take care of those puppies. Crassus looked at the fuming Amy, and he wanted to chuckle, but he still put on a serious expression. Really? Amy looked at Crassus in disbelief. Even though she hadn't done anything, those big puppies looked really powerful. Would a single fireball really be enough to take care of them all? Of course it's true, but not now. As long as little Amy learns magic from me, it won't take long. No matter how many puppies come tonight, a single fireball spell will be enough to take care of them. Crassus nodded with a serious expression. He then smiled and said, "Of course, if Amy wants to use her wand to knock those puppies on the head, it'll be no problem at all. All right, I'll study hard. If they come again, I'll knock their heads on the head." Amy nodded with a serious expression on her little face. Then, her gaze fell on the untouched tofu pudding in front of her, and her eyes immediately lit up. She looked at Crassus with elation, and asked, "Master, did you order this for Amy?" "I haven't eaten it, but aren't you full already?" Crassus said with a peculiar expression. "I was full, but I'm so angry that I'm hungry, so I'll eat it. I didn't even have savory tofu pudding for dinner." Amy had already reached for the spoon, and was happily eating. Crassus shook his head with a resigned smile. However, he was also in a very good mood at the sight of her eating happily. He also picked up the spoon and continued to eat the sweet tofu pudding. "Little Amy, this is a magic shield that can be used 3 times. If you're in danger, use a small fireball to burn that little red bead, and the shield will automatically open to protect you." After dinner, Crassus took out an exquisite blue crystal bracelet and put it on Amy's wrist. In the middle of the bracelet was a red bead about the size of a pinky finger. There were some complicated runes engraved on the bead, and it looked very magical. The guests looked at the bracelet in Amy's hand and were a little envious. There was no need to doubt the effectiveness of a magic shield given by a great magician. Moreover, it was so small and convenient. It was really enviable to have such a master. So powerful. "Can I try it on now?" Amy's eyes lit up as she looked at the bracelet with an eager expression. "Not now. You can only use it when you're in danger. You only have 3 chances, so it would be a pity to waste them. I have to wait for the materials to arrive from Rhodu before I can make a new one for you." Crassus hurriedly stopped him. The magic shield could be immune to all attacks below level 9 for 3 minutes and could be activated 3 times. The materials used and the manufacturing process were very complicated. "All right, thank you, Master Halfbeard." Amy nodded and retracted her hand. She looked at Crassus and thanked him. "You're welcome." Crassus waved his hand with a smile. He couldn't hide the smile on his face no matter how hard he tried. As expected, he was very happy to spoil his disciple. After Crassus finished his tofu pudding, he paid the bill and left. Sargeras returned to the restaurant with the Burning Legion. However, only Sargeras came in with a chair in his hand. The guests sitting at the table at the entrance of the restaurant just happened to be paying the bill, so Sargeras pulled out his folding chair and sat down at the table. "What would you like to order?" Yarbemia walked over to Sargeras with a smile on her face. She had a good impression of these ferocious-looking but kind-hearted demons after witnessing Sargeras slap the werewolf away with his chair and beat him up with his other lava demons. Yarbemia looked at the other demons standing outside the restaurant, and was a little confused. "There are still empty seats in the restaurant, why aren't they coming in?" "I'd like 30 Ruggiamos," Sargeras said with a bashful smile. As soon as Sargeras said that, everyone in the restaurant turned to look at him. 30 Ruggiamos. I've never seen anyone buy Ruggiamos like that. 30 Ruggiamos? Yarbemia was also a little surprised. Sargeras usually only ordered 11 Ruggiamos. "Yes. According to the tradition of the lava demons, we have to treat our most valiant warriors well after a battle. They all did well today." Sargeras nodded with a smile. He looked at the lava demons outside the restaurant with a satisfied expression. "All right, please wait a moment. But if they want to eat together, there are seats available in the restaurant now." Yarbemia didn't ask any more questions. "It's all right. Let them eat outside so they don't scare the other customers." Sargeras shook his head with a bashful smile. Scaring the other customers was one of the reasons. In fact, Sargeras was more worried that they wouldn't be able to afford the compensation if they accidentally set the restaurant on fire. "All right." Yarbemia didn't insist. After all, Ruggiamos didn't have to be eaten in the restaurant. He turned and walked to the kitchen. In the kitchen, Meg listened to Yarbemia's order and said with a smile, 36 Ruggiamos. 1 extra for each of them. Take it as a token of my appreciation. Meg had a very good impression of these lava demons, especially when they stood up for justice and shouted for Ruggiamo's tonight. He was a little touched. Maxa poked his head into the restaurant and looked expectantly at Keel. Keel, are the holy Ruggiamos that our boss mentioned really that delicious? Not just delicious. You'll know in a moment. It's so delicious that you can't stop eating, Keel said with a mysterious smile, keeping Maxa in suspense. So mysterious. Looks like there really is something good to eat tonight. Kossuth rubbed his big bald head with an expectant smile. Big bald head, second bald head, third bald head, fourth bald head. Amy sat down at the entrance of the restaurant with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She looked at the lava demons nodding their heads and giving them nicknames. Keel and the others all had strange expressions on their faces, but even their boss had accepted the nickname, Big Bald Head. What could they do? Here's your Ruggiamos. Not long after, Yarbemia came out with a small mountain of Ruggiamos. He smiled and said, "The boss said that he would like to give each of you a free Ruggiamo to thank you for your help." "Thank you, Mr. Mac." Sargeraz's eyes lit up, and he put 6 Ruggiamos on the tray in front of him. Yarbemia walked out with the tray, and gave the rest of the Ruggiamos to the lava demons standing at the entrance. "Smells so good. Is this the legendary holy Ruggiamos?" Karzak looked at the Ruggiamos in his hands, and his eyes completely lit up. "They look good, but they're a little small. I can eat one in 2 bites." Kossuth tore open a paper bag, and bit off half of a Ruggiamo. The other demons also took a big bite out of their Ruggiamos to replenish the energy they had lost in the previous battle. So delicious. And this feeling. It feels like something is going to come out of my body. The eyes of the demons who had eaten Ruggiamos for the first time widened as soon as they took a bite. Roar. All of the demons let out low roars almost at the same time, and balls of fire rose from their bodies as if there were torches at the entrance of the restaurant. Chapter 303. The lava demons roared in unison, and flames rose nearly a meter into the air. They had successfully attracted the attention of the customers and passers-by in the restaurant. After all, such a spectacular scene wasn't often seen. How is this possible? I think I broke through my 2nd tier seal. I've been stuck at the 4th tier for over 20 years, but now I'm at the 5th tier. I can also clearly feel that the seal is loosening. Even though it hasn't been broken, there's a gap now, so it won't be long before it's broken. A 5th tier mouthful. I also broke through. Expressions of ecstasy appeared on the faces of Kossuth, Maxa, and Karzak as they stared at the Ruggiamos in their hands with incredulity. The seal that had troubled the lava tribe for centuries had been broken through by a single mouthful of Ruggiamo. This miraculous effect left their mouths agape. If it hadn't happened to them, they would never have believed that such a thing could happen. Holy Ruggiamo! It really is the hope of our lava demons' revival. Kossuth took a bite of the remaining half of the Ruggiamo. He could feel the blood rushing through his body, and lava flowing over his skin. It was an indescribable feeling. It was as if the blood in his body that had been dormant for many years had been ignited, and he could see the glory of the lava demons when they had once stood at the pinnacle of the Norland continent. It was the right decision to let them eat outside. Sargeras looked outside the restaurant with a smile on his face. His biggest goal was to let more of his people eat Ruggiamos, and it was also the goal of the Burning Legion. Why do I feel like Mr. Mac has recruited a bunch of very powerful fighters? That's not important. They just helped Mr. Mac out, and Mr. Mac gave each of them a Ruggiamo. If there's another opportunity like this, I'm definitely not going to miss it. If I can get a sweet tofu pudding as a reward, I'm willing to risk my life. The customers also began to discuss spiritedly among themselves as they looked at the lava demons outside the restaurant. Of course, most of them were interested in the reward. A smile also appeared on Mag's face as he looked at the lava demons outside the restaurant. He was more than happy to be able to bring more benefits to his customers while bringing them delicious food. Customers came and went. The late customers were very interested in the disappearance of the restaurant's door. Fortunately, there were many enthusiastic customers. I heard that a 10th tier golden dragon wanted another helping of tofu pudding tonight, but was rejected by Mr. Mac. He was so angry that he wanted to destroy the shop, but he was stopped by two great magic casters. The fight was so fierce that it was Principal Novan who had to step in to stop it. The wooden door was smashed away during the fight. Meg shook his head helplessly as he listened to the increasingly bizarre stories being spread among the guests. Business hours have ended, and the ingredients we prepared have been used up. Everyone, come early tomorrow. At the entrance of the restaurant, Meg turned away the requests of the late customers with a smile. The door was empty, and it looked a little strange. A customer looked at Mag with a serious expression, and said, "All right, but Boss Mag, I heard that a 10th-tier giant dragon has set its eyes on your restaurant. You have to be careful. If you really can't handle it, you can apply for protection from the Grey Temple. I still want to eat at your restaurant often." I'll be careful. Meg nodded helplessly. He really couldn't reject the goodwill of the customers. However, he didn't know who spread the news about the 10th-tier golden dragon, and there shouldn't be such a powerful being eyeing the restaurant yet. "Boss, do you need me to get someone to fix the door? I'm not sure if any carpenters will come," Yarbemia said as he looked at the empty door. "Don't worry about that. I'll find a profiteer later. He'll help me fix it." Meg shook his head with a smile. He looked at Yarbemia and Sally, and said, "Pack up and get ready to leave. You still have to work tomorrow morning, so go back and rest early. Host, please watch your words. The wooden door produced by the system is definitely of the highest quality. The price is fair, and the price is fair." The system's indignant voice sounded. "By the way, Aisha, how many tickets were issued today? And what's the turnover?" Meg ignored the system's voice, and looked at Sally again. "We sold 136 plates of Yangju fried rice, 650 rujiamos, 820 plates of tofu pudding, 416 plates of braised chicken and rice, and 512 plates of cooked rice. The total income is 799,000 copper coins, and we sold 1,022 tickets." Sally walked to the counter, took out a notebook, and reported a series of numbers. "Today, we sold 136 plates of Yangju fried rice, 650 rujiamos, 820 plates of tofu pudding, 416 plates of braised chicken and rice, and 512 plates of cooked rice. Wow, that's a lot of money." Amy's eyes lit up, as if there were little stars twinkling in them. 799,000. How much money is that? Yarbemia looked up and thought carefully. In the past, 600 copper coins was her entire salary, but the restaurant's daily turnover was more than 1,000 times her previous monthly salary. If all of that was converted into copper coins, it would be enough to form a small mountain, right? Okay. Meg nodded with a smile. He was also pleasantly surprised. 799,000 copper coins of turnover, after deducting the cost of ingredients, should be close to 500,000 copper coins of profit. What did 500,000 copper coins a day mean? If they maintained this turnover, this small restaurant could make 180 million copper coins a year, and 200 million copper coins a year wouldn't be a dream, earning 200 million a year from opening a restaurant. Since when did earning money become so easy? Mag was also a little dazed himself. When the restaurant had first opened for business, Mag had still been thinking about how he and his daughter could survive in this world with the help of the restaurant. Now, the restaurant was already on the right track. One dish after another was released, and the number of customers was constantly increasing. The turnover was also increasing again and again, and the rate of development had already far exceeded his expectations. Very good, keep it up. Let's set a small target, and earn 100 million copper coins first. I'll give you a raise next month. Meg looked at Sally and Yarbemia with a smile. The restaurant's turnover had increased so quickly because of Yarbemia and Sally's efficient and accurate work. They deserved a higher salary to enjoy the dividends of the restaurant's development. Boss, I think the salary is already very high. MIA is very satisfied. Yarbemia quickly waved her hand. I'm satisfied too. Sally also nodded. She could eat 2 servings of tofu pudding and 1 serving of Yangju fried rice every day, and this kind of life made her very satisfied. You deserve better. Meg smiled, but he wasn't in a hurry to persuade them. Chapter 304. They're very weak now because they lost too much blood. The magic potion can help them recover to a certain extent, but if they want to recover, they'll need more nutrition and rest. Sally nodded. She was the one who had treated them earlier, so she was more familiar with their condition. Okay, you guys go ahead and take a look. I'll make some chicken soup for them. They probably won't be able to eat anything right now. We'll have supper later to celebrate today's profit. Meg nodded. Today's profit had put him in a good mood. At this rate, it wouldn't be long before he could purchase the next strength point, and the level of the restaurant could be upgraded as well. The system had been messing around for a long time. In fact, he wanted to know what changes would happen to the restaurant after it was upgraded to LV2, and what new privileges would be granted. Of course, Meg was more concerned about the restaurant's defense. What happened tonight gave him a sense of urgency. After all, this was a different world, and there were countless powerful and dangerous beings. Now, even a level 4 werewolf could easily break through the restaurant's defense and pose a threat to him and his daughter. This kind of hidden danger made him feel a little uncomfortable. If the system could upgrade the restaurant's defense system along with the restaurant's level, it would definitely become the safest fortress in the world. Imagine if the restaurant's defense system was upgraded to the maximum level of 10. Even if the same thing happened again, he would only need to carry a small stool and sit in the restaurant with Amy to watch the show. Meg was looking forward to this kind of scene. Father, can we really eat before going to bed tonight? Amy's eyes lit up. Her father never allowed her to eat before going to bed. Yes, you're allowed to eat today. Meg nodded with a smile. He then looked at Sally and Yarbemia and said, "You guys eat before you go." Really? Yarbemia's eyes lit up. Sally's face also had a look of anticipation. Of course. If you're worried about them, you can go ahead and see if they can eat. I'll make supper for you. Meg nodded and turned to go to the kitchen. We'll be going then, Amy said and went out with Sally and the others. System, install the door for me, Meg said inwardly as he turned to look at the empty street outside the restaurant. The system refuses to provide services to customers who slander the system's credibility. The system's slightly arrogant voice sounded. If that's the case, then I'll have to take a day off tomorrow to fix the door. Originally, I thought that with the current turnover, I would be able to upgrade the restaurant in 10 days to half a month. But now, it seems that this kind of thing can't be rushed. Let's plan slowly, Meg said with a calm face. He opened the fridge and took out a turkey drumstick. Then, he began to cut the chicken into pieces. After a moment of silence, the system's voice sounded. After the system's re-evaluation, the host's credibility score is relatively high. Even though you have insulted the system, considering that this is your first offense, the system will be lenient this time. The installation fee this time will be waived. What can you do with 10 copper coins? You're someone who wants to make a lot of money. If you stick to 10 copper coins, you won't be able to achieve great things. Without waiting for the system to finish its words, Meg calmly picked up a handful of shiitake mushrooms and soaked them in water. Then, he began to stir-fry the chicken. Host, the system warns, please do not interrupt the system when it is speaking. I also have my own dignity. I also have my own dignity. I also have my own dignity. The system's angry voice sounded. Then let me ask you. Between 10 copper coins and dignity, which is more important? Meg put down the kitchen knife in his hand and asked seriously. The system fell into a long silence. Ding. 10 copper coins installation fee has been successfully deducted. Ding. Wooden door has been successfully customized. Ding. 20 gold coins installation fee has been successfully deducted. Wooden door is being installed. The system's cheerful voice sounded. In the blink of an eye, the restaurant's door was reinstalled. You win. Meg looked at the restaurant's door, which had been successfully installed. He opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, he swallowed it back down. The system's moral integrity really had no limits. For supper, of course, the mild-natured braised chicken and rice and Yangju fried rice were the best match. After all, eating a rujiamo would make it difficult to sleep at night. It was too troublesome to make tofu pudding on the spot, and the amount of tofu pudding he consumed every day had to be controlled. Mag cooked 2 portions of braised chicken in 2 separate pots. He didn't put any side dishes aside from the chicken and shiitake mushrooms in the pot he had prepared for the druids. He put a little more soup in the pot as it was mainly for them to drink. Chicken soup was very nutritious, especially the combat chicken with shiitake mushrooms. It should be very beneficial for their recovery. The other pot was made strictly according to the standard of braised chicken. They had eaten dinner early. After 4 hours of intense work, Meg was actually a little hungry. Sally and Yarbemia, who had been working non-stop in the restaurant, were probably feeling the same. This was also the reason why Meg decided to make supper for everyone. For supper, I want spicy crayfish, roasted lamb skewers, roasted kidney, and 2 or 3 bottles of cold beer. That'll make it more flavorful. System, give me a recipe for roasted skewers. In the past, I've complained about at least 99 skewer restaurants, if not 100, right? Meg said in his mind as he put the lid on the big pot. This kind of Buddhist way of eating wasn't the right way to make supper. The recipe will be unlocked one by one. Please be firm in your heart as the god of cooking. For the god of cooking, there is no dish that cannot be made, the system said excitedly. Stop spouting nonsense. Meg curled his lips. He had completely understood the system's Taiji style of answering, but there was nothing he could do about it. Father, did you get that profiteer to replace the door so quickly? Amy pushed the door open and walked in with a look of wonder on her little face. Yeah, we didn't even see anyone come to install it. Yarbemia also had a look of curiosity on her face. She reached out and touched the wooden door. It was almost exactly the same as the previous one. It was made of the same wood material. Yes, that guy is shameless, but he's quite efficient. He brought the door himself and installed it in 5 minutes. Meg replied with a smile. He poured the chicken soup into a big pot and then asked, "How are the 2 of them? Can they drink the chicken soup? They're still very weak. It might be a little difficult for them to eat, but they can drink the chicken soup," Sally replied. When they went to check on them just now, Lulu and 1111 had already woken up. They were probably still in pain from their injuries, so they hadn't fallen asleep yet. Then let's bring the chicken soup to them first. Meg took 2 small bowls and 2 spoons, along with the big pot of chicken soup, and placed them on a tray. Then, he carried them to the door. Chapter 305. The magic potion shop looked a little dim with only a dim oil lamp in the corner. In the spacious and empty hall, there were 2 rows of shelves filled with all kinds of magic potions in front of the walls on both sides. The birdcage hanging at the door was covered with a layer of black cloth. Charcoal and Green Bean seemed to have fallen asleep. "Master Julian, I'm bringing them some chicken soup." Meg came in with the chicken soup and saw Julian, who was mixing the magic potions at the counter, with a smile. "Yes, inside," Julian said without raising his head. His voice was still low and hoarse. "Master Turtle, we're having supper tonight. Do you want to join us?" Amy followed him in and asked Julian with a smile. "Supper." Urian's nostrils flared as the alluring aroma of the chicken soup wafted into his nostrils. He swallowed involuntarily, and his gaze fell on the bowl of chicken soup in Mag's hand. "This is for them. If you don't mind, come to the restaurant with us later." "You've been busy the whole night," Meg said quickly. "Go ahead. They'll be asleep soon." Julian looked away and continued to swirl the long-necked crystal bottle in his hand. The blue-purple solution gradually merged in the glass bottle. Meg brought the chicken soup to the door behind the counter. There was a small room inside. The wide counter, which was supposed to be used to store the magic potions, was now occupied by 2 figures, one big and one small. A dim oil lamp was still lit in the corner, and the light fell on their pale faces and tightly held hands. "Boss Mag." 1111 turned toward the door upon hearing his voice, and her gaze fell upon the bowl of chicken soup in Mag's hand. Her nose twitched, and her eyes immediately lit up. Even though she was very weak, she was still filled with anticipation as she asked, "Could it be that you're here to deliver food to us?" "Yes, big sister 1111. Father said that you're too weak, and you didn't eat dinner, so he brought supper for you and Big Bear." You can only sleep when you're full, Remi answered as she hurried into the room. I made some chicken soup. Have some. Meg put the tray on the small table with a smile. He opened the lid of the big pot, and the delicious smell of the chicken soup filled the room. It smells so good. I love the braised chicken and rice. Mr. Mac, you're the best. 1111's eyes lit up, and she struggled to sit up. Be careful. Yarbemia helped her up into a sitting position. The wound on her lower abdomen had already healed after Sally's treatment, but she was still a little weak due to excessive blood loss. I was worried that you wouldn't be able to eat, so I only made some chicken soup. It's not braised chicken and rice. Meg filled 2 small bowls with chicken soup and walked to the bed. He handed one bowl to Yarbemia and held the other bowl in his hand. Looking at Lulu, who was covered in wounds, it seemed that he had no choice but to feed him. Mr. Mac, you're the best. 1111 was very touched. However, her eyes were completely attracted by the chicken soup in Yarbemia's hand. She suddenly turned to Lulu and said earnestly, "But can you feed Lulu some chicken soup first? He lost a lot of blood. He must be very thirsty now." "No. I'll give it to you first. I'm not thirsty. I'm not thirsty at all when I look at you." Lulu shook his head gently. He looked at 1111 with a gentle gaze. "All right, don't stand on ceremony. Let's drink it together." Meg rolled his eyes. They were just here to deliver chicken soup, but they were being fed dog food. Was there any justice in this world? This chicken soup was lighter than the braised chicken soup. Yarbemia scooped up a spoonful and blew on it before feeding it to 1111. 1111's eyes immediately lit up. What a delicious chicken soup. Even though it's not as thick as the braised chicken soup, the flavor hasn't been diluted in the slightest. Without the taste of the side dishes, the flavor of the chicken soup is even purer, and goes straight to the heart. The delicious chicken soup flowed down her throat and turned into a warm current that flowed to her lower abdomen. The feeling of weakness instantly disappeared. She could clearly feel the world tree, which had withered again to protect her life, starting to absorb this special energy. It was like a sweet dew after a long drought. Even she was infected by its joy. The wound that had been a little swollen and painful became warm, with a slight numbness. The feeling of pain was quickly disappearing. I'm using chicken soup to irrigate the world tree. Will it become strange when it grows up? 1111 had a strange expression on her face when she sensed the world tree in her body absorbing the energy in the chicken soup excitedly. On the other side, Meg was also feeding Lulu the chicken soup with a spoon. Compared to 1111, who had a world tree in her body, Lulu's injuries were more serious. She obviously wouldn't be able to recover as quickly. However, the moment the chicken soup entered his mouth, his throat, which felt like it was on fire due to the excessive blood loss, was immediately moistened. A warm feeling spread throughout his body, and the pain was greatly reduced. His furrowed brows also gradually relaxed. It was even more effective than the potion that Julian gave him to stop the pain. The 2 bowls of chicken soup were quickly finished. Meg stood up and was about to get another bowl for them. "Mr. Mac, can I have some meat?" 1111 looked at Meg with a pitiful expression. She looked at the big bowl on the table with desire in her eyes. "Are you sure you can eat meat?" Meg looked at 1111 in surprise. She was struggling to even move just now, but now she wanted to eat meat. "Of course I can eat meat." 1111's eyes lit up immediately. She seemed to be in a better mood all of a sudden. She nodded with certainty. "All right then." Meg looked at 1111, who was in a much better state after drinking the chicken soup. He scooped a few pieces of chicken into her bowl and passed them to Yarbemia. Then, he scooped a bowl of chicken soup for Lulu. "I'm full. I won't drink anymore. Give the rest to her." "Thank you." Lulu looked at Meg, shook her head gratefully, and said firmly, "Okay." Meg looked at Lulu, who had no intention of negotiating, and took back the bowl in his hand. Meg admired this wife-spoiling maniac. After all, there were plenty of men in this world who could say nice things. A man who could choose between life and death to save his wife deserved respect. "Help me up. I can still have 3 more bowls." After drinking the second bowl of chicken soup, 1111 had already recovered some of her mobility. She swallowed the chicken in her mouth, and spoke with an excited expression on her face. The World Tree was constantly healing her body, and at the same time, replenishing her energy at an extremely high rate. Chapter 306. The dark and eerie Bastille prison was like a giant beast that was lying dormant underground. It had a strangely shaped horn in the darkness, guarding the southwest corner of Chaos City, and intimidating the chaotic night in Chaos City. Master Brandley, the Gabriel Black Cross serial murders have been cleared up. The first case was the murder of a Knight's deputy examiner 3 years ago. A family of 4 was brutally murdered. 2 years ago, a body was found in the soars south of the city, with a cross carved into its arm. After 2 years of silence, 3 consecutive murders took place in Chaos City 3 months ago, including the deaths of 2 children under the age of 10. A black cross was left behind at the scene of each of the murders. After careful comparison, we found that the black cross found on Gabriel's body was made of the same material and specifications as the black crosses left behind at the scene of the crime. Furthermore, we found more black crosses in Gabriel's residence, as well as the severed limb of one of the victims. We can conclude that he's the murderer of the serial murders. Within a dimly lit room, a man in a set of black robes with a black cloth over his face was reporting to Brandley with his head bowed in a respectful manner. Do Devoe and Goodnia have anything to do with this? Why did they attack Mammis? What are they trying to achieve? Brandley asked. The 2 of them most likely don't know anything about the serial murders, so they can be exonerated from this case. However, the owner of the Devoe Tavern, Devoe, has a lot of underlings. 2 years ago, he ordered Gabriel to beat up the owner of a winery for a sum of money, resulting in the latter being permanently disabled. After that, Devoe took over his winery. There are quite a few cases of him hiring thugs to rob others of their belongings, and one of them died from severe injuries. Goodinia's situation is slightly better. He had a conflict with Mammis over a bowl of tofu pudding, and he felt humiliated in the restaurant, so he asked Devoe to come with him. Who would have thought that something like this would happen? The man hurriedly replied. If the Devoe Tavern's actions are so atrocious, then why didn't our Grey Temple do anything about it? Severe injuries and deaths are no small matter. Brandley's brows furrowed. About that. The man began to speak, but hesitated. Speak. Brandley's gaze sharpened. Prior to our investigation, the Devoe Tavern had already been reported to the Grey Temple many times, but due to some unknown reason, it was suppressed. The earliest report could be traced back to 3 years ago, the man said in a low voice. Is there a mole? Brandley asked. Sir, this is not something we can investigate with our authority. The man shook his head slightly and did not continue. All right, I will report this matter. Brandley nodded in response, and didn't ask any further questions. The Grey Temple had a clear hierarchy of authority, and no one was allowed to investigate cases without the corresponding level of authority. This rule effectively restricted the authority of all levels of the Grey Temple, but it also made investigating cases a lot more complicated. Furthermore, someone has tried to bail Devoe and Goodnia out during this period of time, and there are people who are not in charge of this case who are trying to find out more information. It's very likely that the confidential information of this 4th-tier case has already been leaked, the man said after a brief silence. Who's trying to bail them out? Brandley's frown deepened. The Aden Chamber of Commerce, the man replied in a quiet voice. Looks like they're getting more and more involved. They've most likely forgotten who they are. Brandley slowly clenched his fists as he strode toward the door, and said, Tell Deputy Warden Jonathan that Lord Roland has been keeping an eye on Bastille this entire time. Yes. The man lowered his head deeply to express his deepest respect. In a dark hall that was over 10 meters tall, specks of light were embellished in the upper part of the hall, making it appear as if there were a series of stars. At the very center of the hall was a round platform that was over 2 meters tall, and an elf in a dark blue magician robe was gently waving her wand. Specks of blue light drifted out of the tip of the wand before landing on the stars, making them appear even more dazzling. This was an elf of indeterminate age, and her facial features were quite ordinary, but she gave off an extremely regal air. Her face was expressionless as she looked up at the countless stars in the sky, as if she were looking at the seeds that she had sown. At the very center of the hall was the largest and brightest star, and not a single star dared to approach it, let alone compete with it in terms of brilliance. In the distance, there was a slightly larger star that seemed to be slowly rising. It wasn't as bright as the largest star, but it was still far more dazzling than all of the stars around it. Mistress Helena, that bitch Irina dares to threaten the future of the elven race that you've chosen? She deserves to die. She's a degenerate who has been abandoned by the gods, an elf whose body has been sullied by a human, and a bitch who has given birth to a bastard. How dare she be so arrogant? How dare she? Below the platform, an old woman with a crooked body and a hooked nose yelled in a shrill voice, and she looked as if she were about to spring to her feet with rage. Shut up. The princess is not someone you can insult. The elf on the platform spoke in an indifferent voice, and a black leather whip appeared out of thin air before lashing heavily into the old woman's face, causing a crisp crack to sound throughout the entire hall. The hunchbacked elderly woman was sent flying, and only stopped after crashing into a stone pillar. She stood up with the help of the stone pillar in a trembling manner, and half of her face was completely swollen. She looked up at Helena with horror and bewilderment, and asked in a trembling voice, "Mistress Helena, did I say something wrong? If our brethren were to learn of what she did, how would she be able to continue living in this world, continue to occupy the Tree of Life, and continue to be regarded as the elven princess?" You're right. Irina has indeed done something that brings shame to our elven race. She has been sullied by a human and abandoned by the gods. Helena turned to Heidi, and the black whip instantly coiled around her neck before lifting her up into the air until she was at eye level with her. She shook her head, and said, "However, if news of this were to spread, the reputation of our elven race would be tarnished, and we would be the laughingstock of the entire Norland continent. As such, only a few people can know about this, and not even one more will know about it. Now that you've learned of this, you'd better keep it to yourself. Otherwise, I think a dead person is more reliable." Heidi looked at Helena with horror and awe in her eyes. The whip around her neck made her feel the aura of death. Furthermore, this was all brought to her by Mistress Helena, whom she had served for hundreds of years. She hurriedly nodded vigorously before her neck was snapped. "Remember, Irina is the only princess of our elven race until a new princess appears. You have to know who you are." Helena raised a finger, and the whip around Heidi's neck was withdrawn before falling to the ground with a thump. "Yes. Yes." Heidi sprawled onto the ground with her face pressed tightly against the ground. Chapter 307. Hearing Amy's question, White Cat and Black Bear, the first thing that popped into Meg's mind was Rolly. Rolly was the most carefree animal in the world, as it was able to survive by acting cute every day. However, Lulu and 1111 were still druids in essence. They had just transformed into a bear and a white cat. As for whether their babies would turn into pandas, Meg wasn't sure. But from the looks of it, the prerequisites were already met. As for whether their genes were strong enough to give birth to a giant panda, that was something worth looking forward to. 1111 was also stunned. She looked at Lulu with a blissful smile. "Lulu said she wants to give birth to many babies with me, so we can have bears and cats in the future. That way, we won't have to worry about it anymore. Then, can I play with the babies after you give birth?" Amy looked at 1111 expectantly. "Of course you can play with little Amy. You're a big sister from now on." 1111 nodded with a smile. She was also looking forward to it. 1111 quickly finished her third bowl of chicken soup, as well as half a bowl of chicken. A faint green glow appeared on her lower abdomen, and her face returned to normal. "Mr. Mac, little Amy, Aisha, and Miss Yarbemia, thank you so much for saving me and Lulu," 1111 said gratefully as she got off the counter and bowed to Meg and the others. "It's nothing, you're welcome." Meg shook his head with a smile. "Don't be afraid, big sister 1111. If any bad guys come, Amy will chase them away," Amy said, clenching her little fists. "Yeah, I think you guys are the good guys, and those werewolves are the bad guys. It's only right that we help you." Yarbemia nodded. Sally nodded slightly and didn't say anything. She looked at 1111's lower abdomen with surprise in her eyes. When she was treating 1111 earlier, she discovered that there seemed to be something in 1111's body that could absorb life magic. The feeling was similar to life magic but completely different at the same time. She found it very mysterious and even thought that she was hallucinating. But now, in this green light, she felt the same aura. This strange magical energy must have played a crucial role in the recovery of such a serious injury and being able to get out of bed so quickly. Although the braised chicken soup was delicious and nourishing, it was still far from being a panacea. Lulu, let me feed you some chicken soup. You have to drink more to get better. 1111 walked slowly to the table, scooped a bowl of chicken soup and walked to Lulu. You drink. I'll just watch you drink. Lulu looked at 1111, whose complexion had improved a lot, and his heart was completely at ease. He shook his head with a doting look in his eyes. No, if you don't drink, I won't drink either. 1111 pouted and shook her head. She scooped up a spoonful of chicken soup and blew on it before slowly feeding it to Tang Wulin. She said with a smile, you drink the chicken soup, and I'll eat the chicken. That way, we can finish this big bowl of chicken soup. Let's go and have some supper. Otherwise, we'll all be stuffed. Meg picked up Amy and walked out the door. It wasn't good to eat too much sweet food in the middle of the night. Yarbemia and Sally also followed them out the door silently. They had just survived a disaster, so they should give them some space. Lulu looked at 1111, and slowly raised her hand to touch her face as she said with a hint of self-reproach, 1111, I'm useless. I didn't protect you well. Says who? Lulu is my big hero. There's no one in this world more powerful than Lulu, and no one cares about me more than Lulu. 1111 shook her head, and he was the only person in her golden eyes. I hope you dote on me like a child, and I worship you like a hero. After treating Julian to supper, Sally used magic to clean up the restaurant before going home with Yarbemia. Their busy day had finally come to an end. Meg locked the door and lowered the blinds. He looked at Amy, who was urging Ugly Duckling to run around the restaurant, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. He wasn't in a hurry to go upstairs. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down to watch. Meow Tilda Ugly Duckling turned to Mag with a pleading expression. It had only had a few bites of the braised chicken, yet it was being forced to run 10 laps around the restaurant. This was physical punishment. Meg chose to ignore it. He looked at Amy, who was waving a small leather whip as she followed behind Ugly Duckling with a smile. Of course, it was more important for the little girl to have fun. After running 10 laps, Amy picked up the exhausted Ugly Duckling, who was lying on the ground. She gently rubbed its little head, and said, Ugly Duckling is such a good girl. You've run 10 laps. Do your best tomorrow. Ugly Duckling rolled its eyes upon hearing that, and fainted in Amy's arms. Let's go. It's time to go upstairs and sleep. We still have to go to Teacher Urian's for class tomorrow. The class starts at 7:30 a.m., so we can sleep a little longer. Mag switched off the lights and carried the two little ones upstairs. After washing up, Amy lay down on the bed and turned to look at Meg. Father, Grandpa Principal is so awesome. Can I become a powerful magic caster like him in the future? Of course. As long as Amy learns magic from Crassus and Master Julian, you'll become even more powerful than Principal Novan in the future. Meg nodded with a smile. She had inherited the bloodlines of a 10th tier knight and a 10th tier elf magic caster, and was learning magic from 2 10th tier great magic casters. Meg felt that Amy's future was limitless. A super great magic caster. Amy closed her eyes happily, and soon fell asleep. Little one, let me protect you before you become a super great magic caster. Meg walked to the bedside, and leaned over to kiss the hair in front of her forehead. He tucked her in, and turned to the door, saying in his heart, System, I want to buy a sword. The system can provide thousands of choices. Long swords, short swords, heavy swords, soft swords. As long as it's what the customer needs, I have it all here. The system's voice sounded in the standard salesman's tone. The one last time was enough, but I have a condition, Meg calmly interrupted. Please speak, host. As my strength increases, I'll have to keep changing swords. You'll have to take back those obsolete swords, Meg said seriously. Chapter 308. The recovery is only half of the original price. Trust me, with my advancement speed, you'll definitely make a profit. Meg smiled and said indifferently, you should know that there's a weapon shop right next to me. For 1,000 gold coins, I can also customize a good standard long sword. When the time comes, it won't be difficult to sell it for 500 gold coins. The so-called buyer's market referred to a market trend where supply exceeded demand, and buyers were in an advantageous position in the transaction. When dealing with the system, Meg habitually placed the transaction in a buyer's market. This way, he could take the initiative in the transaction. From experience, this was a very efficient way to bargain. Deal. Ding. 1,000 gold coins have been successfully deducted. The long sword has been prepared and can be delivered at any time. The system's somewhat unwilling voice sounded. Let's do it now. Leave the sword at the balcony door. Meg's lips curled up slightly. He took out a set of loose but not cumbersome clothes from the wardrobe and changed into them before walking to the balcony. When he opened the balcony door, a long sword was already placed at the door. It was the same long sword he used to complete the mission in Stranglethorn Vale. After nearly being killed by the system's long sword that fell from the sky, Meg no longer had any confidence in the system's logistics. When it came to acting cool, it was better to be cautious. If the system didn't cooperate, it would be easy to fail. Meg reached out and picked up the long sword. The hilt was slightly cold to the touch. It weighed about 2.5 kilograms, and although it was a bit heavy, it didn't seem cumbersome at all. He twirled the sword in his hand, and the edge of the sword glinted coldly under the cold moonlight, unparalleled in sharpness. Gently closing the balcony door, Meg took a deep breath. His state of mind became incomparably calm, and his expression also became serious and solemn. If one were to say that the repeated cooking during this period had brought about many changes to Meg, the most obvious one would be his state of mind. How to focus on one thing, how to enter a state of mind in a short period of time. After experiencing death, he began to understand what was important to him. In the quiet night, he held the black long sword in his hand, as if it had become one with the darkness. Then, he abruptly thrust it forward. It was a very simple strike, without the slightest extravagance, as if it was just a casual stab. But this sword was very straight, perfectly straight. The tip of the sword, the body of the sword, the hilt, the wrist, the forearm. They were all in a straight line, as if they had been measured with the most precise ruler, without the slightest deviation. It was so straightforward that there was no way to avoid it. Meg sheathed his sword and stabbed out again expressionlessly. It was still a straight strike. The angle, speed, and even the height of his hand did not change at all. On the balcony of the 3rd floor, Meg stood in place under the moonlight. He raised his hand and silently stabbed again and again. Every strike seemed to be the same, but also different. The monotonous and boring sword strikes seemed effortless, but it did not take long for Meg's forehead to be covered in fine beads of sweat. The clothes on his back were drenched in sweat, but every strike was still straight, and the angle and speed of his strikes were impeccable. 98, 99, 100. After unleashing the final sword strike, Mag slowly withdrew his slightly numb hand and heaved a long sigh. A numb sensation traveled from his fingers all the way up to his entire right shoulder, but his eyes were particularly bright as he looked at the long sword in his hand, as if he were reminiscing about something. 13 forms of dark shadow, a simple killing technique. The first form, straight stab. When practiced to the extreme, one can counter all changes by remaining unchanged. This is the real sword. Meg whispered to himself. This was the swordsmanship that Meg Alex had persisted in practicing for more than 10 years. The first 5 moves were the simplest swordsmanship moves: stab, point, swipe, collapse, and slash. Meg Alex had practiced each move tens of thousands of times, and the movements had long been deeply imprinted in his body. Meg's body had partially recovered, and now what he needed to do was to redevelop his body and stimulate the limits of what he could do at this stage, and completely control the abilities of his body. The advancement of strength was a gradual process, and Meg wanted to become stronger, but it was somewhat different from ordinary people who worked hard to practice. The system gave him a body that had once reached the peak of human beings, and then slowly activated the potential of this body with his physical strength points. Moreover, in his memory, there were powerful swordsmanship and combat skills. All this gave Meg a very high starting point and unlimited potential, but he was still Meg, not Alex. It was like the system had prepared the best kitchen and ingredients for him, and threw the best recipe and experience bag into his mind. However, in order to make the most perfect dish, he also needed to practice countless times in the test field for the god of cookery, and transform the experience of others into something that he was proficient in, and use the best ingredients to make the most perfect dish. Now, Meg faced the same problem in order to improve his strength. He had the best body, and in his mind, there were the most suitable techniques and experiences for him. The only thing he lacked was how to completely turn these things into his own. Of course, the current Meg was very good at doing this. Meg felt that things that could be done with continuous effort were not a problem. In the test field for the god of cookery, he practiced day and night without sleep, and he did not retreat at all. In the future, he would take 1 or 2 hours out every night to practice swordsmanship on his schedule. After twisting his wrist, Meg switched the long sword in his hand to his other hand, and continued to stab forward with the sword in his left hand. His movements were just as accurate and fast, or even faster. On the Norland continent, everyone knew that Meg Alex's right-hand sword was very fast, but many people also knew that his left-hand sword was even faster. On that night 3 years ago, when he was ambushed by 6 10th-tier powerhouses, Alex had killed 3 of them, and he had used his left-hand sword. It's a pity that I can't use origin power before I reach the 5th tier. That's a pity, Meg thought to himself as he practiced his swordsmanship seriously. He flipped through the incredible sword techniques in his mind, and his heart itched a little. The so-called origin power was somewhat similar to the internal power in wuxia novels. The innately weak humans were able to have the last laugh during the war among species, and share the continent with the 8 major species equally. The most important thing was that humans had awakened the cultivation method of origin power 1,000 years ago, and that gave them the ability to fight against giant dragons and demons head-on. The cultivation of origin power increased the upper limit of the human body. Whether it was strength or speed, it could be improved with the increase of origin power. And after reaching the 5th tier, coupled with the corresponding battle techniques, one could even release origin power, and increase one's combat power in a straight line. A 50-meter-long saber aura might be a little exaggerated, but a 3 to 5 meter-long sword aura was not an exaggeration. Back then, Meg Alex was at the peak of the 10th tier, and his sword aura was 12 meters long, and he shocked the world by slaying a dragon with one sword. Just the thought of splitting a fireball with one sword made one feel inexplicably high. Chapter 309. Of course, Meg didn't even have any essential power in his body right now, let alone sword intent. However, as his strength increased, his essential power should be able to slowly recover. With the support of essential power, humans could do many things that they couldn't do before. That purple-striped griffin was one of the main reasons why Alex was able to slay dragons back then. The true key to his strength was the enhancement of his essential power. Essential power combined with powerful sword techniques had terrifying power that could easily slice through the tough scales of giant dragons and pose a lethal threat to them. That purple-striped griffin and that sword-wielding man made even giant dragons feel threatened and fearful. There was even a period of time when not a single giant dragon could be seen in the sky above Rodu. So-called battle techniques were actually methods of using essential power in battle. They could barely be regarded as secret martial arts manuals. Only battle techniques could unleash the full potential of essential power and significantly enhance one's strength. The last 5 forms of the 13 shadow forms were actually sword techniques that could only be used after reaching the 5th tier. Meg shook his head to rid himself of the messy thoughts in his mind and continued to focus on his swordsmanship. He hadn't even become a 1st-tier knight yet, so it was still too far away for him to think about sword techniques. The most important thing for him to do now was to practice his swordsmanship and reach the pinnacle of his peers in order to build a good foundation for future improvement. This practice lasted for an hour. Meg wiped the sweat from his forehead and rotated his sore wrists. He placed his long sword under a partition in a small room before going downstairs to wash up. Meg lay in the bathtub filled with hot water and closed his eyes comfortably. After an hour, he had practiced 200 straight thrusts with both hands, allowing him to gain a better understanding and control of his own body. After extreme fatigue, he was also more aware of his body's resilience and powerful plasticity. Of course, an hour definitely wasn't enough. Meg had already formulated a progressive training plan for himself in his mind. He would gradually increase the time and intensity of his training, and he would start practicing every night after Amy fell asleep. This little one's cultivation speed is so fast. I've picked up a new one, so I can't possibly be slower than her. That would be a little embarrassing, Mag murmured to himself as he clenched his fists slowly. There was an unprecedented motivation in his heart. That night, Meg slept very soundly. However, he wasn't awakened by the alarm clock the next morning. Instead, he was awakened by a muffled sound and a slight tremor in his bed. Meg opened his eyes in a daze. He looked at the swaying painting hanging at the head of his bed and immediately sobered up. He threw his blanket aside and jumped up before flying directly toward Amy's little bed. This was an fucking earthquake. Beep, beep, beep. Warning, the cafeteria is under attack. Energy level 3 did not break through the restaurant's defense. At this moment, the system's voice suddenly sounded. Level 3 energy level. Meg immediately stopped in his tracks. The tremor had already stopped. Aside from the tilted alarm clock on the table and the slightly crooked painting at the head of his bed, there didn't seem to be any additional damage. However, when the restaurant had been attacked by a level 3 energy level attack, it hadn't been affected at all. He couldn't help but ask, System, did someone come to cause trouble again? The identity of the intruder is unknown. The method of attack is unknown, the system replied calmly. Meg took a look at the alarm clock on the table. It was only 5 o'clock. He then looked at Amy, who was sleeping soundly on her little bed with Ugly Duckling in her arms. He put on some clothes and quietly went downstairs. Although a level 3 energy level attack couldn't break through the restaurant's defenses, Meg still decided to go and check on the situation. Otherwise, he wouldn't feel at ease. Meg first lifted a corner of the blinds and looked outside. The sky was just beginning to brighten, and there were no pedestrians on the road. The scuffle at the entrance last night had destroyed the shrubs and several trees that were decades old. The Grey Temple would probably send people over to replant them during the day. No one. Could it be a prank? Meg looked around to make sure there was no one hiding in the shrubs not far away. The confusion on his face deepened. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out to open the door. He was still standing in the restaurant when he stuck his head out to look around. His eyes fell on the blacksmith shop at the side, and he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, Boss Morby, what happened to you? The blacksmith's shop that used to look normal had been reduced to a pile of rubble. Morby was sitting in front of the blacksmith's shop with a big hammer in each hand. His face was covered in soot, and at first glance, he looked like a miner who had just come up from the coal mine. He looked very disheveled. Hihi, Mr. Mac, you're awake so early. I accidentally blew up. It's okay. Morby looked up at Meg when he heard the sound, and smiled awkwardly. Blew up. Mag made his way out of the shop, and was greeted by the sight of the smithy that had been razed to the ground. All types of weapons were strewn across the rubble, and even the shop next door had been razed to the ground. Even half of the shop next door had been razed to the ground. The scene could only be described as extremely gruesome. One could only imagine what kind of terrifying explosion had happened just now. Meg's expression became extremely strange. Was this an explosion? This was simply a fucking terrorist attack. How could he be so happy just by being mischievous? Mag looked at Morby, who was sitting on the rubble with a bashful smile on his face, and suddenly realized where this neighbor of his, who was always up to something big, had gone missing for 2 days. Was he conducting a secret underground nuclear explosion experiment? If Meg's guess was correct, the muffled sound and the shaking of the house were caused by the explosion just now. It was a level 3 attack. If the system hadn't activated the automatic defense mechanism, Mammoth would most likely have collapsed like the shop next to it. At that time, they were still asleep, and the consequences were unimaginable. Mr. Morby, it's not very kind of you to do things like this. What if the explosion caused the restaurant to collapse? Even if you want to conduct an experiment, you should at least inform the neighbors first, right? Meg looked at Morby with an unpleasant expression and said bluntly. He sympathized and regretted that Morby's father had been swallowed by the dragon, but this was not a reason for him to conduct an explosion experiment at home. Moreover, before the explosion, Morby did not inform the neighbors in advance. This attitude of not caring about their lives made him a little uncomfortable. Chapter 3:10. Meg looked at Morby's face. His apologetic attitude was very sincere, and from what he said, he seemed to have made 3 layers of protection. The dosage was the same as usual, except that he had thrown in a little bit of magical beast crystal powder. An explosion of this degree could not be caused without a sufficient amount of explosives. Judging from the large crater in the middle of the blacksmith shop, Morby had done the experiment at least 5 meters underground. To be able to cause such damage at such a depth, the power of the explosion could be imagined. Morby's crude explosives obviously could not have done that, so the little bit of magical beast crystal powder he had added must have played a crucial role. Even so, I still hope that you can avoid doing explosive experiments at home in the future. I have to be responsible for the safety of Amy and the guests. Meg looked at Morby and nodded slightly. He could accept Morby's reason, but he absolutely could not accept him continuing to do experiments that even he could not control and predict the consequences. Well, after today's situation, I don't dare to do it at home. It would be bad if I scared little boss. Morby nodded with an embarrassed expression. He then rubbed his hands with an excited expression, and said, "But Boss Mag, I think I've discovered a way to increase that energy. If I add a certain amount of powdered magic beast cores into it, its power will be increased by hundreds or even thousands of times. If I add enough powdered magic beast cores into it, wouldn't it pose a threat to giant dragons?" After receiving Morby's promise, Meg's expression became much better. As long as Morby did not cause trouble at home, Meg did not care what Meg did. Moreover, he was also very interested in this method of increasing the power of explosives in a straight line. After all, this world was so dangerous, and he could not get Italian cannons from the system. Perhaps he could rely on himself and get some self-defense firearms. Setting up 2 Italian cannons in front of the restaurant to defend the place, he felt inexplicably excited just thinking about it. To be able to come up with explosives that were more powerful than TNT in a different world where black gunpowder did not exist, Meg could not help but admire Morby. Could it be that this was the legendary explosive genius? If there are enough of them, and the energy can be compressed and stacked, there should be hope to kill a giant dragon. Meg nodded, pondered for a while, and said, "But if the target is a giant dragon, instead of simply increasing the quantity, I suggest that we rely on compression to increase the density, then use something to launch it, and let the explosion happen next to the giant dragon." "What can launch them?" Morby's eyes lit up as he looked at Meg with anticipation and nervousness. This was the problem that he had been troubled by and wanted to solve. "Cannon," Meg said with certainty. "Cannon?" Morby was puzzled. "Yes, it's a cannon. It's something that can send that thing to the dragon's side." Meg nodded. "Warning. Host, your actions are extremely dangerous. It is very likely to accelerate the development of the Norland continent and cause this world to develop abnormally." The system's serious voice sounded. System, gunpowder was invented in the Tang dynasty. Although it was used in wars later on, it only truly replaced bows and arrows 1,000 years later. Don't try to pin the title of changing the world on my head. I can't afford to accept it. Meg pursed his lips, and continued, "Furthermore, I didn't invent the gunpowder in this world. That guy came up with TNT right away. I can only look at such a genius and sigh." The system fell silent. Is there really such a thing? What is this cannon? Morby could not help but take 2 steps forward as he looked at Meg with an excited expression. Meg's words were like pokes at his heart. "Cannon. You can think of it as a projectile, But this thing only exists in my imagination now. I'm not sure if it can be used in reality. Meg shook his head with a smile. Then, Mr. Mac, can you tell me more about it? I really need this kind of thing very urgently. If it can really be used, I can pay you a fee. Morbai looked at Meg with an intense gaze. I don't need money. It's just that there have been a lot of troublemakers coming to the restaurant recently. If Boss Morbai can really make a treasure that can kill a giant dragon, can you put one in front of the restaurant to intimidate those troublemakers? Meg smiled as he waved his hand. Morbai was stunned for a moment before he nodded, and said, if it can really be made, of course. My idea is not very mature, but perhaps you can use it as a reference. Have a seat in the restaurant first. Meg nodded, and turned to walk into the restaurant. Morbai looked down at his dusty clothes and black hands, and shook his head, and said, I'll leave it for now. I've already asked them to come over and fix the house. I'm so dirty, and the restaurant is going to open soon. I can't delay Mr. Mac's business. It's okay. Come in. The waiters will clean up before they come to work. There are some things that I need to draw for you to understand. Meg pushed the door open and said without looking back. Morbai hesitated for a moment, but still pushed the door open and entered the restaurant. Wash your hands and face first. Meg walked out of the kitchen with a basin of water in his hands, and placed it gently on the table. Thank you. Morbai looked into Meg's eyes. Although Meg had been suppressing his anger before, what he felt now was respect. Meg took away the basin of water that had turned black, and came out with a glass of water, placing it gently in front of Morbai. Then, he placed the pen and paper in his hands on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He looked at Morbai with a smile, and said, drink some water. What I'm going to say might be a little complicated, but just listen to me. Anyway, before you can control the stability of the explosives, it's actually too early to make a cannon. Explosives? Morbai sat down, drank a mouthful of water, and looked at Meg in confusion. Meg immediately came back to his senses. There was no such thing as explosives in this world. He smiled and asked, what are you going to call the explosive thing you made today? Now that you mention it, it seems to be a good name to call it explosives. Morbai thought seriously and nodded. Chapter 3:11. Is this the legendary cannon? Morbai stared at the drawing on the paper for a long while before turning to Mag with a peculiar expression. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't help but feel that this drawing wasn't very legitimate, and he couldn't think of a way to use it to throw it out. Meg stared at the paper for a while after hearing that. He had not drawn for many years, and had degenerated into a spiritual painter. This cannon was indeed a little hard to say. This is a sketch. Let me draw you a more detailed schematic. Meg turned a page calmly, sat up straight, and started drawing on the paper seriously with the pencil in his hand. Meg drew Morbai a cannon with the simplest schematic. It was almost at the level of the red coat cannon in the late Qing dynasty. It had a large barrel and a front-loading method. The schematic was simple, and it was relatively easy to manufacture. Of course, the most important thing was that Meg did not know much about more advanced cannons. It was really difficult for him to draw a schematic. It was not a problem for him to draw a schematic of a gun. He was familiar with it. However, the difficulty of manufacturing a gun was not comparable to that of an ordinary cannon. The various craftsmanship requirements were extremely high. It was much more difficult to make a gun with a higher lethality than a simple cannon. The right way to start was to start from the basics. After all, he was a man who had a professional background. It was naturally not a problem for him to draw a simple schematic of a cannon when he was serious about it. The schematic of a cannon is actually very simple. However, the lethality mainly depends on the explosive sealed in an airtight iron ball. The energy released at the moment of explosion determines whether the bomb can kill a giant dragon. As for the specific schematic, Meg explained the schematic of a cannon to Morbai in simple terms as he drew. Morbai's initial doubts gradually turned into trust. His eyes became brighter and his expression became more and more reverent. It was as if the door to a new world had been opened. The specific schematic is roughly like this. The core and most important factor in manufacturing a cannon is the strength of the cannon body. This determines the effective range of the cannon. You are a blacksmith, so you should know this better than me. Meg put down the pen in his hand. On the paper, there were 3 pieces of standard flame-colored paper. Even the manufacturing process was marked in detail. Mr. Mack, you must be a genius. Morbai stared at the blueprint for a while, then looked up at Meg with admiration in his eyes. Meg's culinary skills had already conquered his stomach, so the genius idea that he was showing now completely convinced him. If the explosive that he had unwittingly experimented with was a novel discovery, then Meg's current idea was to put this novel discovery to practical use. Using the huge energy generated by the violent combustion of the gunpowder to propel the projectile into the air, using the semi-enclosed long barrel to create a sealed space, and at the same time, allowing the projectile to have a controllable trajectory. What a genius idea! I'm not a genius. I just know a little bit more. Mag shook his head with a smile. It appeared that Morbai had understood his intentions. As for what kind of cannon he could create, that wasn't something that Mag had to worry about. It would most likely take him a lot of time to create a cannon barrel that met the standards. And before the problem of the stability of the gunpowder was solved, there was no way to proceed. As a man who could make his own bullets, Meg was actually quite knowledgeable about the ratio of gunpowder. However, Morbai's method of adding the powder of magical beast caused to the gunpowder to increase the power of the explosive was simply black technology. This made Meg hold back his urge to make suggestions. Without the restriction of fixed thinking, he might really be able to make a terrifying explosive. After all, this was a different world. Bullets made from ordinary gunpowder might not even be able to penetrate the defenses of ordinary magical beasts. This was also why Meg felt that even if firearms appeared in this world, it would be difficult to change the world. After all, a powerful fire magician was more useful than a cannon. However, the magic crystal gunpowder that Morbai had concocted had given Mag a glimpse of a certain possibility. Regardless of whether it was a powerful bomb or a firearm, perhaps it really could pose a threat to giant dragons after a massive explosion of energy. Morbai put away the 2 pieces of paper on the table, stood up, and looked at Meg solemnly and gratefully. It's a complete casting, and it needs to be able to withstand the previous explosion. It's not a simple thing to make such a cannon body, but I'll do my best to study it. Meg smiled and shook his head, not forgetting to remind Morbai again. You're welcome. However, I still hope that you won't do any explosive experiments at home in the future. Otherwise, living next to you will be a little insecure. According to the principle of gradual courting death, the degree of courting death would gradually increase with each courting death. Meg did not want to be blown up into the sky one day in his sleep. No, I won't. I won't do it in the future. Morbai quickly waved his hand. Boss Morbai, are you still alive? At this moment, a voice full of energy called out from outside. The people who are repairing the house are here. Mr. Mack, I'll go first. I'm really sorry about today. Morbai looked at the door and said apologetically. Okay. Meg nodded, and did not say anything else. After all, they were neighbors, and Morbai was the restaurant's first customer. If it's a magic cannon, it might be very interesting. Meg looked at Morbai's back as he walked out of the door. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Suddenly, he was looking forward to the scene of Morbai pulling a cannon and blasting the giant dragon down from the sky with one shot. After putting away the notebook and cup on the table, Meg turned and walked towards the kitchen. He put on an apron and began to prepare the various ingredients for breakfast. When holding the kitchen knife, Meg felt a slight numbness in his entire right hand, from his fingers to his shoulder. The high-intensity training last night had more or less affected his body, but the benefits were obvious. His body's sensitivity and reaction had increased. After chopping twice, Meg suddenly stopped. He looked at the kitchen knife in his hand and then at the chicken leg on the chopping board. He thought to himself, the thing that I repeat the most every day is chopping and cooking. Every action is repeated thousands of times. If I can integrate sword practice into it, wouldn't I be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Chop. Mag took half a step back as he murmured under his breath. He swung the cleaver in his hand, and the chicken leg was severed. The incision was very smooth, and only a shallow cut was left on the chopping board. Not bad, but I need to improve the control of my strength. Meg nodded slightly. The kitchen knife in his hand chopped down again, faster and faster. Under the knife, the chicken was cut into small diamond-shaped cubes. Chapter 312. Today is the first day of the Aden Square food competition. I wonder if there are any new good restaurants in the Aden Square this month. This thing can only deceive those diners who don't come here often. The top 10 of the list hasn't changed for 3 years, and the top 30 are always the same few restaurants. Every month, it's just a formality. There is no reference value at all. That's right. Not to mention the top 10, the top 30 hasn't changed for several months. I even ate all the top 30 restaurants according to the list. Many of them are not even as good as the ones ranked after the 50th place. It's getting worse every year. Over 20 years ago, the Aden Square food competition was truly a guide to good food. Any restaurant that made it into the top 10 would definitely be a delicacy that would satisfy the vast majority of people. But now, sigh. There were already many people gathered in front of the magic screen at the center of the Aden Square, waiting for the rankings to be updated at 7 a.m. There were customers who wanted to see if there were any new restaurants, as well as restaurant owners and waiters who had been ordered to keep watch. Boss, our Ricky's rotisserie will definitely make it into the top 30 again, right? A young man who was dressed as a waiter turned to the portly middle-aged man beside him with a fawning smile. Of course, our Ricky's rotisserie took the 30th spot on the Aden Square food competition last time, and it's been there for 3 consecutive months. It's received a lot of praise from our customers, so our target this time isn't just the 30th spot, it's the even more prestigious 29th place, Ricky said with a smug expression. His voice had intentionally raised a few octaves, and he could sense the envious gazes directed at him from all around him, and the smug smile on his face grew even more pronounced. As a member of the Chamber of Commerce, Ricky's rotisserie was guaranteed a spot in the top 30. Even though he had spent a lot of money to secure a spot in the top 30, it wasn't a bad deal for him to give up a month's worth of profits in order to secure a spot in the top 30. After being in the top 30 for 2 months in a row, the rotisserie's turnover had nearly doubled. As long as it moved up one more spot, the turnover would definitely continue to rise. When that time came, they could buy the restaurant next door and expand the scale of the restaurant. The business that had been stagnant for more than a decade would be able to take another step forward. This was business. Opening a restaurant in the Aden Square, it was difficult to stand out from the crowd just by relying on good food. Although the Aden Square food competition wasn't as effective as it used to be, as long as one could make it into the top 30, the advertising effect would still be very significant. Of course, this ranking had almost become the private ranking of the Aden Chamber of Commerce. Apart from a few long-established companies, the other companies that could enter the top 50 were all members of the Aden Chamber of Commerce. Every month, the competition for the ranking was very intense. This was also a business. These fools cast every vote so seriously, but what's the use? Could it be that being delicious really gave one a high ranking? The current ranking is not the same as it was 20 years ago. Ricky swept his gaze over the expectant customers, and a mocking smile appeared on his face. He raised his chin proudly as he looked at the employees who were anxiously adjusting the statistics. Luther, where do you think that restaurant will rank? Alvin, who was standing aside, gently nudged Luther with his elbow and asked. In my mind, the top 4 should all belong to Mammis, Luther replied in a soft voice. He paused momentarily before continuing, but it's going to be a little difficult in reality. The size of the restaurant and its attitude toward food have limited his votes. Perhaps 1 or 2 dishes have a chance of making it into the top 50. Making it into the top 50 on the first day? Is it really that good? Alvin was a little surprised. Even though they were employees, even the president didn't know what the results would be until the voting results were tallied. I strongly suggest that you try their rugiamo and sweet tofu pudding. They're a little expensive, but they're definitely worth the price, Luther said with a smile. All right, when I get my salary this month, I'll definitely go and try something that you and the vice president can't stop praising. Alvin nodded with an expectant look on his face. Vice President Robert very rarely commented on a restaurant's quality, but he had recommended the savory tofu pudding the day before. Gyurge, what do you think Mr. Mac's restaurant's ranking will be? In the crowd, Harrison was trying his best to open his eyes as he tried to find Mammis on the ranking. In terms of deliciousness alone, it should be in the top 5, but this ranking is a little exaggerated, so it's hard to say where it'll rank. Perhaps it'll make it into the top 30, Gyurge mused. As veteran foodies in the Aden Square, they had long since broken away from relying on the ranking to find good food. However, they had cast their votes for Mammy Restaurant the day before, so they stopped to take a look today. In any case, the restaurant wouldn't open until 7:30 p.m. After watching the rankings, they would have something to talk about when they lined up later. They weren't the only customers with such thoughts. Even they didn't understand why they cared so much about a restaurant's ranking. Top 30. If it's not in the top 10, I'm going to vote with my feet. Gyurge was a little annoyed as he said, the ranking has become more and more unsightly over the years. If you want to find a restaurant with good taste, you have to choose from the top 50 and below. But Mammis is enough for now. If I were to go to another restaurant, I might not be able to eat it. Don't let the other bosses hear you, or they'll cut you up, Gyurge said with a smile. He couldn't help but shake his head as he looked at the restaurants on the ranking. Apart from a few old brands that were indeed good, many of the restaurants at the top of the ranking had only become popular in recent years because of some gimmicks and the ranking. Their taste wasn't even as good as the restaurants below the top 50. It's almost time, someone in the crowd called out at this moment. Everyone reflexively raised their heads and craned their necks to look at the first magic screen. The top 30 dishes and restaurants would appear on the first screen, and the prices of the top 30 dishes for the month would be printed on the first page of the Food Association's recommendation page. A confident smile appeared on Ricky's face. His goal for this month was to reach the 29th position. He had already earned the money, and all he had to do now was bask in the envious gazes and congratulations of others. This was why he had woken up so early to come here. A worker with a serious expression gently pressed a square magic crystal into the groove at the center of a black pillar in front of the magic screen. The blue light shone, and the words on the magic screen flickered a few times before turning black. Then, the red words slowly lit up. 29th place, Mammis. Braised chicken and rice, 30th place, Mammis. Laji Ruggiamo. 2 cries of surprise rang out from the crowd. Chapter 313. TH. That's impossible. Ricky's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the bottom 2 rows of words on the first magic screen with a hint of agitation in his eyes. He had lost the 29th place that he had always dreamed of, and now he had even lost the 30th place. Furthermore, it was the same restaurant that had dealt him one fatal blow after another. It was a restaurant that he had never heard of. Just the day before, he had received confirmation from the Secretary General of Mars that Ricky's rotisserie was definitely in the top 30. But what the hell was going on here? A completely unknown restaurant had appeared out of nowhere and taken 2 of the top 30 spots, pushing Ricky's rotisserie down to 31st place. Ricky was unable to accept this stark contrast, and he felt as if all of the envious looks in his eyes had turned into mockery, and his expression darkened significantly. Boss. WH. What's going on? The employee stared at Ricky's rotisserie on the second magic screen with a dumbstruck expression. The surrounding customers were also looking at Ricky with schadenfreude in their eyes. There were many restaurant owners among them who had heard Ricky's boastful claim that he was going to make it into the top 30, and they were all quite elated to see him suffer such a setback. All of them had heard about the Aden Chamber of Commerce manipulating the rankings board, and they were all quite displeased by it. However, the Aden Chamber of Commerce was extremely wealthy, and they were in cahoots with the Catering Association, so they didn't dare to voice their displeasure. However, this restaurant by the name of Amy's had appeared out of nowhere, and 2 of its dishes had made it into the top 30, thereby allowing it to invade the Aden Chamber of Commerce's territory. Regardless of whether Amy's rotisserie had made it into the top 30 or not, As long as it wasn't a restaurant owned by the Aden Chamber of Commerce, they felt as if they had vented their frustrations. I don't even need to look to know that someone must have used dirty tricks to push their rankings higher than ours. I'm sure the Catering Association will give us a fair explanation for such despicable behavior. Ricky harumphed coldly as he tried his best to calm himself down. He looked at the dazzling rankings, and an even more confident expression appeared on his face as he said, "This is a completely unknown restaurant. I've never even heard of this name before, and it has never appeared on the Aden Square before. However, for some reason, 2 of its dishes have made it into the top 30. If this ranking is accurate, then I'm going to run a lap around the Aden Square naked. Fuck. It was only 29th place. How could such delicious braised chicken and rice not reach the top? What kind of bullshit gourmet rankings is this? Ruggiamo is supposed to be the first. The king of pastries, Largi Ruggiamo, let you experience the true meaning of life with one bite and regain the feeling of surging blood. His only ranked 30th. At least it's in the top 30. The sweet tofu pudding that's so sweet that I forgot to breathe is ranked 99th. That's the most intolerable thing. This is an insult to my faith. A heresy like sweet tofu pudding shouldn't be on the list. You heresy bastards gave my beloved savory tofu pudding 1 star and pushed it all the way to the top 100. Which dish can compare to my delicious savory tofu pudding? You're forcing me to vote with my feet. I'm very unhappy that my favorite Yeongju fried rice is only ranked 72nd. I've eaten all of the dishes on the rankings, and none of them can compare to my Yeongju fried rice. This ranking is ridiculous. Everyone in front of the magic screen erupted into an uproar as soon as the rankings were released. Aside from the owners of the restaurants that didn't make it onto the rankings, the most raucous of all were the customers of Amy's. None of them were satisfied with the rankings. In particular, after seeing the sweet tofu pudding and savory tofu pudding that ranked 99th and 100th, the atmosphere immediately became extremely tense. However, the sweet and savory factions were scattered all over the place, and it was difficult to tell who was friend or foe, so everyone was repressing their anger. The top 30 of the rankings are basically the same as last month, but the last 2 restaurants are from a restaurant that I've never heard of. Since the Catering Association was able to count the votes, then there should be no problem with the votes. This restaurant is very likely to be the biggest dark horse in this competition. That's not necessarily the case. Maybe this restaurant's name won't be on the rankings tomorrow. Even though everyone knows that you can get on the rankings as long as you're rich, if they make it too obvious, then the Catering Association will lose face. Does the Catering Association still have such a thing as face? They probably haven't had any since 15 years ago. Outside the crowd, a few restaurant owners looked on coldly as they whispered among themselves with a hint of mockery in their voices. If I'm not mistaken, they seem to be arguing about that Amy's restaurant. For the customers to care so much about the rankings and have such a strong sense of honor, this restaurant definitely isn't simple. I'm even more convinced that it's a dark horse that's going to disrupt this year's Aden Square food competition. Among the crowd, a young man with a head of red hair that was casually tied behind his head said with a smile. He had a delicate and handsome face. Everyone fell silent upon hearing that. As they listened to the argument, their expressions gradually became more and more interesting. Even though they didn't know what the salty and sweet tofu pudding were, they were indeed arguing about Amy's. Even though the argument was extremely heated, there was one thing that both sides agreed on: the restaurant's ranking was too low. This was a restaurant that had appeared on the Aden Square food competition for the first time, and all 5 of its dishes had made it into the top 100, with 2 of them even making it into the top 30. Were these people complaining that the restaurant's ranking was too low? One had to realize that even Duca's restaurant, which had placed first on the rankings for its roast lamb, had only placed its second dish at 38th place, and only 3 of its dishes had made it into the top 100. Could it be that the restaurant even hired people to create controversy? That was the first thought that flashed through everyone's minds. No. That's the owner of the largest cloth shop in the Aden Square. That red-faced man over there is the owner of the gold shop. That man with his sleeves rolled up is from the Grey Temple. And there's also a powerful figure from the City Lord's castle. How could these people be hired people? Soon, Everyone identified the identities of these customers. They were all extremely wealthy and powerful, and there was no way that a small restaurant could afford to hire them, unless that restaurant was opened by the city lord's son-in-law. It didn't seem strange that a restaurant that could drive all of these esteemed customers into a frenzy would become the dark horse of this competition. I'm going to go see just what kind of backer this restaurant has. How dare they try to fake the rankings like this? I'm going to expose them right here and now. I'll show all of our customers that not just anyone can make it onto the Aiden Square food competition, let alone make it into the top 30. Ricky squeezed his way out of the crowd with a dark expression. He looked around before grabbing his employee by the collar, and angrily asking, "Where's that Amy's?" "Well, I don't know, either," the employee replied with an innocent expression. Chapter 3:14. Boss, the Aiden Square Food Competition Rankings Board had already been updated when we arrived, but... Yarbemia's voice trailed off as she looked at Mag with a hesitant expression. "How did it go? Did our food get a good ranking?" Meg's eyes lit up as he walked out with 4 servings of tofu pudding in his hands. He turned to Yarbemia with anticipation in his eyes. Although this was only the first day of the ranking battle, the ranking could basically set the tone. Yesterday's turnover was the restaurant's peak. Before he launched a new dish or his strength improved, it would be difficult for him to make another breakthrough in a short period of time. Father's food must be at the top of the list. It must be the best, Amy said confidently as she held Ugly Duckling in her arms. I think there must be something wrong with the rankings. Boss Mag's food is clearly 100 times better than theirs, but... Yarbemia's expression became even more conflicted at the sight of Mag's expectant expression. She clasped her hands together and looked at Mag with an anxious expression. She wanted to console him, but she didn't know how to phrase her words. Her cheeks immediately blushed, and she didn't know what to say. Sally looked at the conflicted Yarbemia and said to Meg, "Braised chicken and rice is ranked 29th, Laji Rugiamo is ranked 30th, Yangju fried rice is ranked 72nd, sweet tofu pudding is ranked 99th, savory tofu pudding is ranked 100th. These are the rankings of our 5 dishes on the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings." Sally's expression was also quite conflicted. In her eyes, Meg's food was the best in the world, and such delicious food should be in the top 5 of the Aiden Square Food Competition rankings. Even the savory tofu pudding, which she had never tasted before, was definitely in the top 5. Yarbemia and Sally both looked at Meg with concern in their eyes. Even they felt that it was a pity, so Meg had to be even more disappointed. It must be very difficult to cook such delicious food without receiving the recognition and respect that it deserved. "Father, are you all right?" Amy also looked at Meg with concern in her eyes. "Is braised chicken and rice really ranked 29th? Rugiamo is also in the top 30? Meg's eyes lit up when he heard Sally's words. Yarbemia and Sally turned to Mag with perplexed looks on their faces. They had thought that he would be very sad, but his expression was one of elation and surprise, as if he were very satisfied with his ranking. "Yes, this is today's ranking. The next update should be at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Sally nodded. "Very good. Since we've achieved such good results on the first day, we need to keep it up. At the very least, we need to keep the braised chicken and rice or Rugiamo in the top 30. Meg nodded in satisfaction. He wasn't pretending to be surprised. He knew more about the Aiden Square Food ranking than Sally and the others. It was a ranking that relied on a combination of all kinds of data. Delicious food alone wasn't enough. Without enough customers, even if all the customers gave a 5-star rating, it would still be very difficult for a restaurant to reach the top. Compared to the larger restaurants, Mami Restaurant was still able to provide far less food and serve far fewer customers on a daily basis. It was already beyond his expectations that 2 of its dishes would be able to make it into the top 30. Even though it barely made the cut, Mag didn't care about anything else as long as he could complete the system's top 30 mission. Yarbemia and Sally opened their mouths. They still couldn't understand why Meg wasn't angry. Instead, he seemed to be pleasantly surprised. "Sit down and have breakfast." In view of your excellent performance, from today onward, you'll be provided an extra serving of tofu pudding as your daily meal. Meg didn't explain. He put the tofu pudding on the table one by one and smiled at them. What else would you like for breakfast? I want a rugiamo. Yarbemia raised her hand. I want a plate of Yangju fried rice, Sally said expectantly. Okay, please wait a moment. Meg nodded with a smile. He turned around and walked to the kitchen. Sally and Yarbemia looked at each other with happiness in their eyes. There was nothing happier than being able to eat delicious tofu pudding and the food they liked early in the morning. There's water in the back of the room. Wash up yourself. At the entrance of the magic potion shop, Julian was holding a handful of grains and playing with charcoal. He didn't even turn his head when he heard the footsteps behind him. His voice was so hoarse that it sounded like a demon that had just crawled out of hell. Thank you for saving us. 1111 and Lulu stood still and bowed deeply to Julian at the same time. You're druids. Urian slowly turned around and looked at the two of them with a deep gaze as he spoke in a firm voice. 1111 and Lulu's expressions changed at the same time. Lulu took half a step forward subconsciously and shielded 1111 behind her. She looked at Julian nervously. Don't be nervous, little ones. I'm not a good person, but I'm not a bad person either. Julian threw the grains back into the small jar. He sat down on a deck chair and looked at them with narrowed eyes. What's the relationship between you and Fariadin? Great Druid. Do you know Master Fariadin? 1111's eyes lit up. She walked out from behind Lulu and asked in surprise. A hint of surprise also appeared on Lulu's face, but he was still looking at Urian with a wary expression. They were the only two druids left on the entire Norland continent, so there were very few people who could identify them, and even fewer who knew the names of the great druids. Yes. When that old guy was dying, he asked me to help him find two little ones. He said that the hope of reviving the druids lay in those two little ones. Since the world tree is with you, it seems that those two little ones are you. Julian nodded slightly as he looked at 1111. 1111 and Lulu's expressions changed slightly again. They were already very surprised that they were recognized as druids. The world tree was the only hope of reviving the night elves, and they had never mentioned it to anyone. This is what Fariadin gave me. He asked me to give it to you. Julian reached out and took a palm-sized green square box from a shelf. He gestured for 1111 to take it, and calmly said, I'm Julian. Perhaps you've heard of my name. Lord of Ice Julian. Chapter 3:15. The shock in 1111 and Lulu's eyes didn't fade away for a long time. Although they had been hiding on the continent for more than 100 years, as magic casters, they had naturally heard of the famous big shots in the world of magic, especially the high-profile battle between ice and fire. And now, the legendary Lord of Ice was sitting right in front of them. Although they had already felt Julian's terrifying ice magic last night, they didn't think of that legendary magic caster. However, their eyes were now attracted by the small green square box in Julian's hand. 1111 hesitated for a moment, and then stepped forward to take the small square box. Her eyes turned red immediately. The palm-sized square box was a little old, and its surface was covered with some strange runes. It looked a little messy, but in the eyes of 1111 and Lulu, it was so familiar. This was the language of the druids, a symbol that belonged to them. It had been more than 100 years. Ever since they left the Dark Night Forest, they hadn't gone back, nor had they seen Divin again. It really is the great druid. 1111 turned the box over in her hand, and her finger gently rubbed the signature on the bottom right corner of the box. She looked a little emotional and a little sad. He gave this to me more than 100 years ago. There should be a seal on it that is unique to the druids. It has never been opened, Julian said. Yes. 1111 nodded in response. Her eyes quickly glanced at the words on the box. She raised her left palm, and a small sapling with only one leaf at the top appeared in her palm. It slowly flew toward the small box in her right hand. The sapling tilted its leaves, and the green leaf touched the box gently. It was as if a pebble had been tossed into a calm lake, and the runes on the surface of the small green box lit up one after another. The box left 1111's hand and slowly rose into the air. Beams of rainbow light shone out of the box, and the quicksand that filled the air swirled around the surface of the box, appearing extremely gorgeous under the illumination of the rainbow light. This is the Great Druid's quicksand world. 1111 couldn't help but exclaim while covering her mouth. Yes, it's the drifting sand world. Lulu also couldn't hide her excitement, her lips trembling slightly, and she had an impulse to prostrate herself. Quicksand world? Old thing, you're too careless. Aren't you afraid that I'll take everything for myself? Julian had unknowingly sat up straight. He raised his head and looked at the small box that was overflowing with light in the air. His eyes were also filled with astonishment. The door of the shop slowly closed. The drifting sand world was an independent small world. The night elves worshipped the world tree, and the world tree was famous for being able to nurture a true small world. The quicksand world was a small world nurtured by the previous world tree, and was managed by a highly respected great druid. The druids were exterminated, the world tree was toppled, and the quicksand world was nowhere to be found. Only the great druids knew where the quicksand world was. The other clansmen didn't even know what it looked like in this world. They could only kneel down and worship it every time they made a sacrifice. Every time it appeared, its appearance was different and ever-changing. The only things that didn't change were the colorful light and the sand that filled the sky. The small world tree in 1111's hand also appeared to be very excited after the light appeared. Its branches and leaves swayed slightly as it bathed in the seven-colored light. The green area of the leaf at the very top of the tree seemed to have expanded slightly, and it became even more lively. Just then, the light flashed on the sandbox, and an intangible figure appeared on top of the sandbox. It was a white-haired old man wearing a green mage robe. He looked very benevolent, and he looked at Lulu and 1111 with a gentle gaze. He smiled and said, 1111, Lulu, you've grown up. Great Druid Master. 1111 and Lulu bowed with reverence in their eyes, and they took a step forward reflexively. However, they stopped in their tracks at the sight of the old man's ethereal body, and repressed their grief. Children, don't be sad. You two are the only ones who can walk the path ahead. I'm very happy to see you two again, and a new world tree. This means that I didn't choose the wrong people when I gave you the heart of the world tree. Fariadin looked at the small world tree with relief. But, Great Druid Master, 1111 didn't protect the world tree well. It's about to wither. I couldn't make it grow healthily, 1111 said, looking at the small world tree in front of her and blaming herself. No, you've already accomplished the mission I gave you back then by hatching the world tree. You must have suffered a lot in order to avoid the pursuit of the werewolves and the search of the elves. To be able to do this, you're already the heroes of the druids. Fariadin shook his head and praised. Now, I'll give the quicksand world to you. The quicksand world almost collapsed during the war back then. I used up the last of my natural force to reform it, but the inside of the world is no longer stable, so you can't enter. The small square box in front of Fariadin floated to 1111. His eyes shone faintly. He looked at 1111 and said, put the world tree in there and use the power of laws to reform the quicksand world. Build a new world on the ruins of the quicksand world. Since this world can't accommodate us druids, we'll build a new world and let the glory and civilization of the druids reappear. I'll leave it all to you. 1111 reached out and gently grasped the small square box that was glowing with seven-colored light. The fine sand covered her right hand, then swirled up her arm and almost covered her entire body in the blink of an eye. Only her neck and hands were exposed, as if she was wearing a colorful dress. 1111 closed her eyes, and could clearly sense that there was a connection between her and the quicksand world that was slowly forming. The world tree slowly flew toward the box, and then took root on the box. Its roots grew at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye, and grabbed onto the box like a series of tentacles. The small tree with yellow branches and leaves took root on an old green wooden box. The seven-colored sand swirled around it. Everything looked strange, but strangely harmonious. Lulu was a little nervous as he looked at 1111 from the side, but he didn't say anything. This was a kind of inheritance, the inheritance of a great druid. Inheriting a world was a special inheritance of the night elves. Only the most honorable great druids could receive this inheritance. This process lasted for about half an hour. Chapter 3:16. Disperse. 1111 muttered softly. The wind and sand stopped immediately, and retreated back into the little box. The rainbow light on the little box also gradually faded, and a green light lit up on her hand. In a flash, the box and the world tree disappeared without a trace. Very good. From today onwards, you are the great druid 1111, Fariadin said to 1111 with praise and relief. 1111. How can 1111 be qualified to become a noble great druid? No, 1111 can't. 1111 shook her head like a rattledrum, and was a little flustered. The world tree's approval is the only criterion to become a great druid. You are doing better than I did back then. Fariadin smiled, and said, furthermore, compared to the simple-minded Lulu, you are obviously more suitable. 1111 looked up at Lulu. Lulu was also looking at her with an encouraging smile. Her originally uncertain heart was suddenly filled with confidence. She felt the world tree jumping excitedly in her body, and looked up at Fariadin with a solemn nod. I will make it grow well, and become a towering world tree again. I believe you can do it. I also believe that you will be able to make the night elves reappear on the Norland continent one day, so that the druids can continue to reproduce. Fariadin nodded with a smile. His body started to become more and more illusory. He turned to Julian with a smile, and said, Julian, see? I told you that you would grow old, too. You didn't believe me. Now, you have reached the age where people call you an old thing, right? At least I am still alive. Old thing, you have been dead for over 100 years. Julian pursed his lips with displeasure. Speaking of which, I am a little envious of you young people. But so what if I am dead? I am tired of living for hundreds of years anyway. Dying would be peaceful. Fariadin didn't get angry. He paused for a moment before looking at Julian and solemnly said, Then before you die, please help me keep an eye on them. My druid race can't be destroyed. How many children they can give birth to will depend on their own abilities. Julian pursed his lips. Ha ha ha, little brat, you're still as naughty as before. Fariadin laughed as he completely disappeared. The magic potion shop fell into silence. 1111 looked up at the ceiling in a daze. Lulu put her hand on her shoulder gently and said nothing. Julian slowly leaned back on the recliner. His face was expressionless, but his eyes seemed to be reminiscing about the past. At that time, he was still young and liked to wander around. Before he became a legend, he met many interesting people and did many interesting things. You can make magic potions in my shop as long as you don't mind the low pay. After a long silence, Julian looked up at 1111. Really? 1111 was stunned for a moment before a look of surprise appeared on her face. She said excitedly. Even though the werewolves from yesterday had already been captured and wouldn't be released for a long time, the werewolves were very powerful, and there were far more powerful beings in their tribe. They would definitely continue to pursue them, so they couldn't stay in Chaos City any longer. However, 1111 and the others had just found a way to restore the world tree, heal their bodies, and regain the ability to give birth. If they were to leave Chaos City, they would never be able to eat Mr. Mac's braised chicken and rice again. That was unacceptable to them. However, if Julian took them in to help in the shop, it meant that he would protect them. The protection of the legendary magic caster Julian, the Lord of Ice, meant that they would be absolutely safe in Chaos City. Then, what about Lulu? Can she stay? 1111 hesitated for a moment before asking nervously. I don't use people who are too clumsy. Julian shook his head. He looked at 1111, whose expression had collapsed, and said slowly, You can stay in that room upstairs. It's up to you how many people you want to stay in. He's your man, so you have to earn money to support him. Thank you, Master Julian. 1111's face lit up, and she bowed to Julian again. Thank you. A smile also appeared on Lulu's face. She also bowed deeply to Julian with gratitude. They had been wandering on the Norland continent for over 100 years. They had been through too many life-and-death situations since they were children. What they yearned for the most wasn't revenge, but a place where they could rest and truly live. They only wanted to have more children so that the legacy of the Druids could continue with them. They wanted to recreate that great race. Yesterday, they saw hope, and then fell into the despair of death. In the end, they survived with the help of Meg and the others. They had thought that they would continue to face the unknown future, and continue to be on the run and be hunted down. They didn't expect that everything would end just like that. The shop only sells magic potions, healing potions, recovery potions. As long as it's on the shelves, you have to make a bottle and put it on the shelves every time it's sold. That's your job every day. After deducting the cost, you get half of the profits from the sales. There's no minimum salary. Julian pointed to the various magic potions on the shelves. He got up and took out a black magic book covered in dust from the counter. He casually tossed it on the counter, and said, "This is a guide to making magic potions. If you don't know how to make it, you can look through it yourself. Anyway, it doesn't matter how effective it is as long as it doesn't kill you." "But, isn't half too much?" "Master, this is your shop, after all," 1111 said embarrassedly. "Don't think it's a lot. Half is only enough for the two of you to eat half of your fill every day." Julian pursed his lips, and walked out of the shop as he said, "Since you're fine now, you can start working today. This breakfast is on me. Is it Mammis?" "Thank you, Master Julian." 1111's face lit up at the mention of food. She didn't say anything else about the commission, and quickly followed him out of the door. There was already a long line outside the restaurant. Compared to a few days ago, the smell of gunpowder between the sweet and savory factions was especially strong this morning. Many people were arguing with each other, and even their sleeves were rolled up. It was as if they would explode at any moment. "Heretics who eat sweet tofu pudding, I'm warning you, stop giving 1-star ratings to the savory tofu pudding as soon as possible. Don't you feel guilty for doing such a thing?" "For me. It's the savory faction that should reflect on themselves. Sweet tofu pudding's dignity is not to be insulted. The 99th ranking is shocking. Women will cry if they hear it, and men will fall silent if they hear it. Draw your sword, heretics." Someone in the crowd let out an angry roar. Clank, clank, clank. Chapter 317. The sound of swords being drawn in unison made Julian and the others stop in their tracks, and all of them turned toward the long line outside the restaurant with surprised looks on their faces. Ricky had rushed over with his employee with the intention of exposing this restaurant's true colors, so that his rotisserie could return to the 29th place that it rightfully belonged to. However, he was given a massive fright by what he was seeing, and he immediately stopped in his tracks. After the swords were unsheathed, a deathly silence ensued. Many of the ordinary people in the long line were a little intimidated by the gleaming swords, but their insistence on the flavor of tofu pudding made them stubbornly stand on the spot. They glared at the other party without any intention of backing down. "Ugly duckling, do you think they're finally going to fight? We've been waiting every day, and they're really drawing their swords this time." Amy sat down on a small stool with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She rested her chin on her little hand, and her eyes were wide with anticipation. "Why are there so many people in line? And why are they drawing their swords? Could it be that there's more than one person with the same idea as me, and they're all here to cause trouble?" Ricky looked at the two long lines in front of the restaurant with a bewildered expression, and all of the knights and swordsmen in the president's line drew their swords. "Boss, what should we do now?" the employee behind him asked in a quiet voice. He had also been quite intimidated by this scene. "At a time like this, we obviously need someone who can raise his voice. Our Ricky's rotisserie is the biggest victim of this fraud, and as the owner of the restaurant, I'm naturally not going to back down." Ricky's heart immediately began to pound violently, and blood surged from his chest into his brain. His face immediately became flushed, and he strode toward the two long lines before raising his arm and yelling, "Down with this fraudulent restaurant. Boycott this fraudulent food. Destroy this fucking restaurant." The situation at the entrance of the restaurant was extremely tense, and it was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. As such, Ricky's yell was clearly audible to all of the customers. All of the customers turned to Ricky in unison, and their eyes were filled with surprise and concern for a mentally handicapped child. Although the sweet and salty factions were fighting, no one would agree to the accusations of cheating, and smashing this fucking restaurant. These votes were cast by them one by one. They were not satisfied with such a low ranking. Wasn't this guy deliberately slapping them in the face by spouting such nonsense? Moreover, he wanted to smash the restaurant. Many people thought of the Burning Legion, who had been rewarded with Ruggiamo yesterday. If they acted courageously and helped Mr. Mac deal with this troublemaker in advance, maybe Mr. Mac would be happy and give each of them a Ruggiamo. At the thought of this, the guest who had already unsheathed his sword looked at Richie with an unfriendly gaze. The werewolves from yesterday were too powerful, but it was still easy for them to deal with such a fat, ordinary person. Bad guy. Father, it's too troublesome to change the gate. Let's not let him in this time. Amy's gaze also fell on Richie. She lowered her little hand from her chin, and a bluish-purple flame danced on her fingertips. Everyone's gazes made Rich's heart rate accelerate even faster. He enjoyed the feeling of being the center of attention, and the rush of blood in his head prevented him from detecting the hidden message hidden in everyone's expressions. The only thing in his mind was that he had become a fighter against fraud. He was going to lead the angry crowd to break through the restaurant's door and smash the restaurant that relied on fraudulent votes to get into the rankings. He was going to drag out the shameful boss and beat him up. He was going to make him admit that he had committed fraud in front of everyone. It had been many years since he had last felt this kind of hot-blooded feeling. It was simply too exhilarating. Down with this fraudulent restaurant. Smash this fucking restaurant. Richie had already begun to unconsciously march forward. He clenched his fists, and his face was flushed red as he yelled with all his might. His eyes were bloodshot, and it looked like he was going to take action. Smash it. Smash it. The employee was also affected by his boss's enthusiasm, and his face was flushed red as he followed behind Richie. He didn't think that his boss would be such a hot-blooded person. Just the thought of being able to lead his customers to smash this fraudulent restaurant made his blood boil. Those two. Did they drink too much fake alcohol this early in the morning? 1111 looked at the two of them making their way toward the restaurant's entrance with an adorable look on her face. There are always some people who like to court death. Julian pursed his lips as he glanced at the portly Richie, and his interest was completely piqued. Richie quickly made his way to the restaurant's entrance, and only then did he turn around to look at the two long lines that had suddenly fallen silent. He had thought that all he had to do was wave his arms, and everyone would rally around him to smash open the gate and follow him into the restaurant. But what was going on with this strange silence? Looks like we're all civilized people, so we need a hot-blooded person to lead the team. I'm naturally more than willing to pass on this responsibility. Richie looked at the crowd, and could feel everyone's eyes on him. They were all looking at him as if he were a hero, and that made him even more confident. His entire body was filled with energy and passion. Don't panic, everyone. I am the owner of Rich's Rotisserie, Richie Bearman, the embodiment of fairness and justice. I'm sure everyone has seen the abnormal ranking of this restaurant after the announcement of today's Aiden Square Food competition. That's right, everyone is right to be angry. I've never even heard of this small restaurant in the corner before, yet 2 of its dishes have made it into the top 30, and 5 of its dishes have all made it into the top 100. This is something that even long-established restaurants that have been in business for decades can't achieve. Hence, I'm certain that there's definitely something wrong with this restaurant's ranking on the Aiden Square Food competition. What rubbish braised chicken and rice. Largi Ruggiamo? How could those disgusting dishes deserve to make it into the top 30? This kind of vote rigging is really shameful. As a loyal fan of the Aiden Square Food competition, I can't allow something like this to happen right under my nose. We have to vent our anger and let those bastards who are trying to manipulate the Aiden Square Food competition know that we're not idiot. Let's smash this restaurant and return the Aiden Square Food competition to its former glory. Richie became more and more agitated as he spoke, and in the end, He waved his arms and yelled out a slogan before taking large strides toward the restaurant's entrance. Chapter 3:18. Bam! A muffled thump rang out as Ricky, who was crashing into the restaurant door with his shoulder, was slapped in the face by the door, and he was sent flying back. The fat man, who weighed over 100 kilograms, was sent crashing into the crowd. The crowd immediately dispersed, opening up a space for him. They watched as he crashed onto the ground with a loud bang. He laid on the ground with his face facing upwards. There was a red door mark on his face. His expression was absent-minded, as if he was a little dazed after being slapped. Meg also faltered slightly upon seeing this. His hand was still on the door handle, and he had just finished his breakfast and was about to remind Amy to go to class. However, he didn't expect that someone would be sent flying through the door just as he was about to open it. He was a little embarrassed as he looked at the portly middle-aged man lying on the ground. If this was a customer, then wouldn't he have accidentally injured him? He sent someone flying through the air just as he opened the door. As expected, Mr. Mac is not to be trifled with. All of the customers looked at Meg with peculiar expressions. Ricky looked like an ordinary person, but he was still a burly man weighing over 100 kilograms, so it was quite a shock that he was sent flying through the air just like that. Of course, the customers who were about to attack him were the most disappointed. However, before they could do anything, Meg had already taken care of Ricky. Wow, father is so awesome. Amy withdrew the small fireball in her hand and clapped her little hands with her mouth slightly agape. She looked up at Meg with reverence on her little face. How could this be? Could it be that the owner of this restaurant is also a powerful figure? Ricky was lying on the ground, and he could feel a stinging sensation on his face. Being sent flying by a door was not a good feeling at all. In particular, the sight of Mag with one hand on the doorknob made the rage in his heart surge even further. He hadn't even made a move yet, and he was the one who got hit first. This guy was clearly the owner of this restaurant, but it didn't matter. Even though he had been knocked down, he still had tens of thousands of friends behind him. All of them were wielding weapons, and there was no lack of orcs and demons among them. No matter how powerful the owner of this restaurant was, he would definitely be the one getting beaten up. With that in mind, Ricky regained his confidence. He endured the burning sensation on his face as he sat up and waved his arm. This owner is trying to cheat the rankings, and he's beating people up. Where's the justice? Where's the justice? Everyone, charge. Smash. Smash, smash my ass. A demon that was close to 2 meters tall slapped him across the face, and slapped him back to the ground. He then gave him a kick, and angrily said, I do have a lot of anger in my heart, and I have nowhere to vent it. It's indeed because of Mammy Restaurant's ranking, but it's the exact opposite of what you said, it's because it's ranked too low. Exactly. The last time I ate the barbecue in your shitty barbecue shop, I found a bug in it, but in the end, you insisted that it was my own bug. Today, I caught you, right? What about the brawny men who beat me up last time? Mr. Mac's food is more than 100 times better than your restaurant's barbecue. Who gave you the confidence and courage to challenge Mr. Mac? What kind of disgusting name is that? I'm drooling at the mention of Ruggiamo now. Stop talking. Brothers, let's not beat up our own people. This guy who dares to slander Amy's and accuse us of cheating is the real heresy. Leave an empty spot for me, I'm going to kick him too. The entrance of the restaurant was instantly thrown into chaos. The customers surrounded Ricky and began to beat him up. Punches and kicks rained down on his body, and the sounds were so dense that it sounded like the sound of a drum. Stop hitting me, stop hitting me. I'm an ally, I'm an ally. Stop hitting me. Don't hit my face. Ricky was a little dumbstruck by the barrage of attacks, and only after a while did he come to his senses. What ally? I'm beating you up. The sweet and savory factions have formed an alliance because of you. An old woman jabbed Ricky in the stomach with her walking stick, and was a little angry. I agree. If we give each other 1 star, those guys will only benefit from it. I don't think the sweet tofu pudding is that good, but if it's made by Mr. Mac, then it's definitely better than other people's. That's right, hurting each other will only result in a lose-lose situation. We should band together and give each other 5 stars. Show those guys the true power of our tofu pudding. The furious customers' punches and kicks instantly drowned out Ricky's cries of agony. Under his incitement, they quickly reached an agreement to cooperate. Seeing as Mr. Mac was selling the same number of sweet and savory tofu puddings every day, there was no way that the sweet and savory tofu puddings would be able to rise up the rankings. As such, cooperation was the only way out for them in order to climb up the rankings. Bo! Boss! The employee looked on with a dumbstruck expression. Just a moment ago, he had been about to charge into the restaurant with his boss, but in the blink of an eye, his boss had been beaten to the ground, and he couldn't even see him anymore. There's another one here. A brawny man grabbed the employee by the collar and tossed him into the crowd, joining in on the beating. What's going on? Meg was just about to apologize, but he was also a little dumbstruck upon seeing this. After listening to the customers for a while, he quickly figured out what was going on. It appeared that these two had come to cause trouble after seeing the Aiden Square food competition this morning. However, they didn't even get to enter the restaurant before being punished by the customers. It was quite a tragic scene. Meg wasn't going to show any mercy to people who dared to cause trouble at his restaurant. He had to establish the restaurant's rules, and sometimes, he had to make an example out of these people. However, Meg was quite touched by the fact that the customers were taking the initiative to deal with the troublemakers. These were a bunch of customers who had only come to the restaurant to eat, but they were actually so concerned and angry for the sake of the restaurant's reputation. He was touched by the actions of strangers. It's not a big deal, so let's not kill anyone. It's still early in the morning, and it's not easy for the patrol office, Meg said to the crowd with a smile. The customers all burst into laughter upon hearing this. Mr. Mac's words weren't very kind. There were so many people here, and if they were tired, they could just switch to another group and beat the crap out of those two. Chapter 319. Mr. Mac, what happened in the smithy next door last night? Why did all the houses collapse? Harrison was squeezed out after a few kicks. He panted heavily as he looked at Mag curiously. The smithy next to the restaurant was still in ruins, and a group of dwarf stonemasons were cleaning up the rubble. They picked up one weapon after another, and then started to rebuild the house with great efficiency. However, there was a huge crater in the middle of the smithy, which was rather eye-catching, as if a fierce battle had taken place there. Even the two houses next to it had collapsed. Maybe a crater suddenly appeared down there. Meg shrugged. It was best not to tell anyone about the explosion. If the Grey Temple or the City Lord's castle found out that Morbai had created such a powerful weapon, they would probably pay as much attention to it as the steam engine. If a weapon that could be controlled by a normal person but was powerful enough to threaten a powerful giant dragon was released to the world, it would definitely have an unpredictable impact on the Norland continent. If Morbai were to research it alone, it would probably take a very long time to come up with a rough idea. However, if the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle were to gather all the resources in Chaos City, they would probably be able to create a powerful weapon in no time. Meg didn't like this way of changing the world. If it happened too quickly, he wouldn't be able to control and predict what would happen. I see. That restaurant is really lucky. Harrison nodded. The 3 shops next to it had all been damaged, but the restaurant next door was completely fine. Teacher Julian, what time is Amy's class this morning? Meg asked with a smile as he looked at Julian, who was making his way over. His gaze lingered on Lulu and 1111 for a while. Lulu's face was still a little pale, but she seemed to be fine. 1111, on the other hand, looked like she had completely recovered. She was an expert in healing magic, so her self-healing ability was also very good. 8 a.m. We'll start after breakfast. Julian looked at Amy with a smile, and said, "Good morning, little Amy." "Morning, Teacher Turtle Shell." Amy also stood up with Ugly Duckling in her arms, and greeted Julian. Then, she looked at 1111 and Lulu, who were following behind Julian, and asked in surprise, "Big Sister 1111, Big Bear, are you two done?" "That's right. After eating the delicious chicken soup made by little Amy's father yesterday, we're all better now." 1111 smiled happily and reached out to stroke Amy's head. Millimeter. I knew that father's chicken soup is the best. Amy nodded with pride on her face. Thank you, Mr. Mac, and the two ladies. 1111 bowed to Meg and Yarbemia and Sally, and said gratefully, You're welcome. Mag shook his head with a smile. Amy liked this girl too much, so he also had a very good impression of this druid girl who had a great affinity with children and animals. It's all right. Yarbemia hurriedly waved her hands with an apologetic expression. Millimeter. Sally nodded slightly. Her thoughts were very simple. They had indeed helped them the day before, so there was nothing wrong with accepting their gratitude. It's time for business. Welcome. Meg looked back at his watch and smiled at the customers before fully opening the restaurant's doors. As for the two guys who had been beaten up by the angry customers, he completely ignored them. Seeing as they were here to pick a fight, they should have been prepared to be scolded. It was too late for them to regret their actions. Sally and Yarbemia stood on either side of the restaurant, one with a smile and the other with a cold expression, and began their day's work. The customers filed into the restaurant, and no one paid any attention to Ricky and the waiter. However, some customers didn't forget to kick them as they passed by. Soon, the restaurant's entrance was empty. I'll be back. Ricky looked up at Amy's signboard, and his face was swollen. He crawled away with great difficulty. This world was too crazy. These people weren't here to mess with the restaurant, they were really ruthless. Boss, wait for me. The waiter also crawled away with great difficulty. What the hell was this? He only shouted a few words, and he was beaten up for no reason. The release of the rankings board in the morning was like a massive bomb that exploded between the sweet and savory factions. However, the conflict that was about to escalate was instead alleviated after they beat up Ricky and his employee, and they even came to a consensus that it was better to help one another rather than harm one another. Meg was naturally happy to see this happen. Even though the braised chicken and rice and Largi Ruggiamo had successfully made it into the top 30, it would still be a great help to the restaurant's reputation if the other dishes could also rise up the rankings. The system's goal was very clear. It wanted to increase the restaurant's reputation. Top 30 this time. What about next time? Top 20, or even top 10? These were all things that Meg had to consider. The morning hours passed in a rush. After Julian finished his breakfast, Amy went to class with him. To Meg's surprise, Julian took in 1111 and Lulu. He was already a little surprised that he had stood up for them last night. After all, the eccentric Julian wasn't a benevolent old man. Why would he take in this druid couple? Alright, I gave the sweet tofu pudding 5 stars, but that won't change my persistence and love for savory tofu pudding. Then I'll give the savory tofu pudding 5 stars as well. Our ultimate goal is to make tofu pudding reach the top of the food rankings list. At the entrance of the restaurant, customers were talking to each other proudly. Boss, they only had 1 serving of tofu pudding, but they put in 2 different flavors. Does that count as cheating? Yarbemia looked at Meg with a worried expression. Well, it's hard to say. Even though we didn't do it, if we look into it carefully, there are indeed some problems. Meg thought for a while and felt a headache coming on. He didn't care about cheating. Getting into the top 30 with his own abilities was his true ability. However, now that the sweet and savory fans had reached a verbal agreement, Meg wasn't sure if cheating was against the rules. In any case, the braised chicken and rice and Ruggiamo tickets weren't a problem. As long as they stayed within the top 30, Meg wasn't worried at all. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.